be starting by recording this for those who are not able to get us streamed directly. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a very special occasion. It's 10 years yesterday since something major happened in Libya. I still haven't figured out what to call it. But about 10 years ago, a group of women gathered in front of the courtyard of the city of Benghazi. They were all demanding an answer to the whereabouts of the imprisoned beloved ones that they've had for many years without any response from the authorities. Before they knew it, the anger that was in front of the court kind of swept throughout the city, and then from one city to the other, and all of a sudden, the revolt that started in the eastern province of Cyrenaica, which was really under a lot of oppression by Gaddafi more than anywhere else. It was marginalized. It was punished by Gaddafi. Before we knew it, the cities of the anger in the cities of the east spread to the angers of the cities of the south and west, and a revolution started. Nobody really anticipated it to be as such. There had been so many questions raised about how it started, why it started, but it was all, there was one thing in common, which is the desire to get rid of a dictator that was controlling the country brutally for 42 years. We're now 10 years since this event happened. Are we now on Zoom? Are we okay? Yes? All right, so I'll just continue. So then 10 years after all this, we're now here, and we have seen so many things happen. Hopes for stability, hopes for civility and prosperity were never fulfilled. 10 years after, never fulfilled. The old regime fought to hold on to any power during the revolution, but then when they felt that they had lost it, they threw in some poison pills. And those poison pills led to a lot of divisions, a lot of fractions, several civil wars, and you can explain it the way you want, and we'll be hearing a lot about how this happened and why it happened. But today, this is what Libya is. Libya is in shatters. Its conditions are just horrible. The 80% of Libyan citizens live below the level of poverty. 30% of the population are migrants in a state of migration from one area to another. There is no electricity. Electricity is quite interrupted quite often. No liquidity in the banks. I think the status of the country today is very clear to everybody. It's a failed state. The United Nations have made several attempts to reconcile and bring things together. They evolved from different agreements, from the Skhirat agreement to a sort of an improvised kind of a process whereby they chose 75 individuals, representatives in many ways of Libyans, but also chosen due to their expertise and civil service. And they put them together and gave them a mandate of trying to choose an executive body that can carry on the functions of the country until a national election would be held in December of this year. So we are now 10 years after. We have a coming interim government again in Libya. We have a new US administration in-house here in the United States. How will this shape up? How are we going to deal with all the differences and the disagreements and divisions that exist in Libya? Where will we be heading in? What will we look like in about a year or so? Will the elections be successful? What are the challenges towards this election? There's so many questions that need to be answered. And I think that I am very privileged to have with me a group of experts on this very special occasion that will try and look back at what happened from 2011 until now, and then forward ideas and so on about what to expect in the next 11 months and further ahead. Without any further introduction, I would like to pass on the responsibility of the first panel to Karim Meizaran. Karim is very well known to all of us here, and those who do not know him, He is a scholar. He heads the Libyan studies and at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. He is a well-established scholar on Libya and has published extensively on it. You can turn around right or left here in the United States without acknowledging Karim Mezaran as a leader of thoughts on Libya. So without any further introduction, Karim, please take on the first panel. Karim? Karim,
of course, I forgot to unmute myself.
Okay.
Very typical. Thank you very much, Hani. I was saying thank you for your words, and you are far too generous. Thank you for organizing this this important event. It's going to be a dense hour with such a great persons in the panel, great scholars. I will try to do my best in introducing each one of them, but whatever I do, it will not make grace to their value and their great capabilities. I will start right away, and the first is the professor Dirk van de Waal. I say the professor because for anybody that studies Libya, he had to go through 2 books, and they were both written by Dirk. And he doesn't need any presentation, but just in case, I remind you, he's a professor of government at Dartmouth College. He specialized in institutional solution and design for weak financial, regulatory, educational, and business environments in North Africa, the Arab Gulf, and Sub-Saharan Africa. He served as political advisor to Jan Martin, the United Nations Special Envoy in Libya in 2011. He's the chairman of the board of the Institute of Current World Affairs in Washington, D.C. And as I was saying, he's the author of the 2 main books that we all have not to read but to study: Oil and State Building, 1998, and The History of Modern Libya, which is coming to its 3rd edition. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Karim, and thank you, Hani. And of course, thank Wolfgang for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I've entitled my talk, and I'll try to stick to the 7 minutes that have been allotted me, the run-up to the revolution and its logical aftermath. And I should say I come at this very much as a political scientist who has studied state building over about 30 years or so, including, of course, Libya. And when I first became political advisor to Ian Martin at the United Nations, one of the people that I met very early on asked me, so how long is this going to take to get Libya back together? And I said, at least a generation. And there was a lot of kind of hemming and hawing, and here we are 10 years later, and as I think Hani said, we're not very far along yet, in a way, in terms of state building. And so I want to approach it from that kind of angle. And here is, I think, what we knew when the revolution started. We knew the profound damage that the Gaddafi government had done in Libya. We knew that there was a kind of a lack of a coherent national imagination, if you want to call it that, under Gaddafi. And that simply meant that once Gaddafi was gone, that politics would become primordial again. Tribe, city, region, below the surface of the state. And I found it interesting that Hani referred to Libya as a failed state. I think the first question would be whether or not Libya really constituted a modern state to begin with, because of how it emerged. The other thing that we knew was that there'd be an enormous amount of fighting over the resources and the control of those resources, and that would be at the heart of the fighting, which indeed it continues until today. But there were always some things that even myself, who had observed Libya for a long time, had really either not known or underestimated. The first one, of course, was that Libya would become kind of a proxy war for regional players. And the second one was the ease with which spoilers, and these range all the way from militias to individual city-states to Jadran to Hifter, all of us can add a dozen more, I think, how those spoilers have been able to hold the process of unifying Libya hostage, and the lack of mechanisms that exist to really bring him to heel in any sense. And then the final thing that I think I certainly estimated, and having studied state building for so long, was that we had assumed that most of the traditional mechanisms that normally work in state building, what I call procedural state building. That is, you build the institutions up of the state, eventually you move toward elections and so on, all of which has been tried until now in Libya, and that would really work. But what we found out was that Libya as an oil state is really sui generis in a sense, and that the mechanisms that may take place in other states really didn't apply at all in Libya. And my underlying point here of this whole presentation is that unless we really think very carefully about the nature of the state in Libya, which, as I described as distributive, it primarily hands out revenues, and that's kind of the core of its legitimacy, that unless the nature of that state and how the state is viewed in Libya, that this is still a long, long ways to go for us in the future. So this kind of leads me to two important questions that I think we may want to think about as Libya moves forward. And the first one is, what incentives can you offer all these spoilers that would allow them to cooperate? And so far, to use kind of a game theoretic image, Libya is a prisoner's dilemma. It's much easier to defect than cooperate for a large number of reasons. And then the second question, I think, is what really will a future state in Libya look like? We've just always assumed that it's going to be this kind of, Eurocentric or at least Euro-viewed sense of state, and that may necessarily be the case. And I think the two questions are actually intertwined. I think the need to move from what I described as this kind of procedural state building, building the governing institutions of the country, elections, et cetera, a cycle we're just about to engage upon again, and now in the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, versus what I would call effective state building, making the state relevant as an impartial and effective interlocutor for Libyan cities. And I think I agree with Hani. From that, if you look at it that way, we're not very far at all. So where are we 10 years later? A glass half full or a glass half empty? I would agree again with Hani that it's probably a glass half empty at this point, unless kind of you consider the fact that the exhaustion is leading people to consider kind of scenarios that they hadn't considered before. So perhaps a small glimmer of hope there. But my overall argument would be that in terms of state building in Libya, bringing Libya together, getting beyond what we have seen so far, and coming up with a process where you can kind of derail the spoilers in that process will take a lot of time. The international spoilers, I think the regional spoilers, the international community will have to take care of. The local spoilers are going to be much harder to discipline, as we found out in the past so far. So my final thought then on all of this is, in Libya, after 10 years, the state remains primarily valued and therefore the focus of conflict for its distributive capabilities, its ability to handle out money, and not for much else. And I just kind of wanted to bring your attention to, you've probably all seen the long article in the New York Times today that they did on the Geneva meeting. And there was a quote there that talked about Abdelhamid Beiba and why he would succeed. And here is what one of the analysts said in that article. He, meaning Beiba, technically has the keys to the safe, and because everybody wants to have access to the state coffers and so on, they're going to try to work with him. I don't disagree. I think his analysis is correct, but I think that's also what's at the very heart of the remaining instability in Libya and what the country needs to get away from, hopefully to make the next 10, 15 years much more productive in terms of looking for a solution than what we've seen so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Lot of food for thought. The next speaker too doesn't need, Dr. Mohammed Airi doesn't need much presentation. We all know him very well. Just as a background, he represented the League of Arab States in many international forums from 1980 to 1982. Then he was chosen to work for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees since 1992 until 2010. He was assigned by the High Commissioner for Refugees as of February 2010 to be an ambassador and regional representative to Egypt and the Arab League and the Palestinian Authority, until he was appointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation since September 2014. Dr. Dairi.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you, Hani, for having invited me to this panel, which I'm glad to participate in. I have been asked to address the issue of what went wrong in Libya for the last 10 years. So I would like to say that, inspired by a staunch desire for fundamental changes that neighboring populations in Tunisia and Egypt voiced in January 2011, Libyans took to the streets of Benghazi, Baida, Zawiya, and Misrata as of the 15th of February 2011, in a challenge to the authority of the Gaddafi oppressive regime. 10 years down the line, the situation in the country remains marred by political and social fractures and the inability of the driving forces to restore peace and security. I will seek to address the external and internal dynamics that have impacted the Libyan crisis in the last decade. So, what external forces did Libya in the last 10 years? It goes without saying that external stakeholders have featured prominently in the political and military environment that Libya has witnessed as of February 2011. Undoubtedly, the foreign military intervention gave way to the regime downfall, and hence the victory of those Libyans who rose against it. Instead of promoting state-building processes, the country needed, as the British public institutions such as the judiciary, police, and other security apparatus weren't able to deliver the basic services. Instead of promoting state-building processes, Western powers were confined to uphold the running of the 2012 elections, considered as a step to establishing democracy. However, the political and military landscape was left to regional powers, whose involvement caused instability and chaos. Nature abhors vacuum, and others came to fill in the gap. In his address to the UN General Assembly in September 2015, former President Obama was candid about the Western powers' negative posture, admitting, quote unquote, "We failed Libya." In the search for solutions at the UN-led process that culminated in the signing of the LPA in December 2015, wasn't the panacea for bringing to an end the deep crisis in Libya. In the search for solutions within that environment, France and Italy plunged in 2017, 2018 in a damaging rivalry over who should be on the lead to fix Libya. And in spite of an European attempt in 2019 that included France and Italy to allow for a lead of the political process by Germany, this shift has since been compounded by the emergence of notably Turkey and Russia as the key players in Libya. However, it must be underscored that out of political expediency, the political settlement that the international community has fostered came as a result of hastily tailored power-sharing schemes, rather than endeavors to embark on processes that address the multifaceted crisis in Libya. If the UN gave ultimately rise last year to new tracks relating to the otherwise critical military and economic sticky issues, it has fallen short of embracing the national reconciliation area, which is equally important to ending the Libya crisis. We have nonetheless seen a glimpse of hope in the last roadmap adopted by the EPLF, which has eventually encompassed a national reconciliation process. However, one should seek fairness and look at the damage inflicted upon Libya by Libyans themselves. The nature of the uprising response to the repression by the government forces in 2012 spurred military confrontations in which many, then representing the dissident of the regime, took up arms. Some army cadre joined in the revolt movement, but others, including civilians, took part in the latter. In the meantime, some extremists of the political Islam streams were also part of the armed struggle that unfolded after 17 February. One should state the obvious as to the bleak outlook that has surfaced in Libya. We shouldn't mince our words, and we must point to terrorists who penetrated the revolutionary ranks and committed atrocities, among which the brutal assassination of late General Abdel Fattah Yunus on the outskirts of Benghazi already in July 2011, and the attack on the US consulate in Benghazi in September 2012, causing the death of US Ambassador Christopher Stevens. It's well established and beyond any doubt that Ansar Sharia group was behind these two terrorist actions. We had to wait for November 2014 to note its designation by the UN Security Council as a terrorist organization. It's with dismay we read researches conducted by international think tank Together with news reports referring, quote unquote, to Islamists or radical groups or revolutionary fighters in eastern Libya without calling a spade a spade. Sadly enough, we must acknowledge that terrorist and violent extremist dimension has overshadowed up until now the security situation. Some honest and brave leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood recently admitted to the crimes perpetrated by terrorist elements and not only ISIS in Benghazi and Derna. On the other hand, the predominance of the armed groups led to human rights abuses affecting civilians throughout the country. Moreover, a destructive civil war has gone unabated, except for a few lulls, between 2014 and 2020. Several parties to the conflict deemed that violence and coercion were a critical means to achieve political ends. These factions attempted to turn their military wins into political reaps, even if the negative impact was the prevalence of two governments with dual sovereign institutions. The civil strife stirred up.
What happened? I can't hear him anymore.
I think we lost him, and we need to move on until we get him back.
Okay. So should I ask Zahra to begin?
I think that would be good. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, he's back. He's back.
Okay. Okay. Not really.
No sound.
Because he's muted, probably.
He's muted himself. Yes.
Can I resume
Yes.
my presentation?
Yeah.
Sorry, Karim, for
No problem. It's not your fault, man. So go on.
So the
Please
upper hand
continue.
of the military groups challenged state authority, considered as a legacy of the former regime. This situation
I think we're hearing you, Mohammed.
We're hearing
the
you.
upper hand of the military groups challenged the state authority, considered as a legacy of the former regime. This situation has markedly weakened the already fragile state institution. It came, therefore, as no surprise to note the absence of the rule of law, the judiciary, as well as the security apparatus being unable to perform their traditional functions. As a result, there was no room for good and effective governance. Criminal cartels and drug militias have been outrageously allowed to be part of state security structures under the alleged revolutionary prism. Among these military formations, only a few have sincerely been driven by the initial principled revolutionary euphoria, which revolved around freedom, democracy, and human rights, as proclaimed by late Abdel Salam al-Mismari, one of the main leaders of the 17 February movement. These militias haven't been shy of plundering public funds and demanding ransoms after kidnapping civilians. Government officials shamelessly engaged in corruption that prompted civilians to public demand.
Mohammed, we can't hear you again.
I think, Kareem, we should really move on to the next talk, and we'll get back to him on the question and answer.
Okay. So the next, I'm sorry about this thing, but the next speaker too was a well-known figure of Libyan politics. Is a quintessential political activist, is Zahra Langi, who's the founder and CEO of the Libyan Women's Platform for Peace, a socio-political movement focused on peace building, inclusivity, and gender equality. From 2016 to 2018, Zahra launched two strategic partnerships with the two oldest Islamic religious institutions, the Zitouna University and Al-Azhar, in an effort to bring together civil society and religious leaders from North Africa and the Sahel to address extremism and human rights. He has contributed significantly to the body of research on digital on Libya. In partnership with the United States Institute of Peace, she has led the research project that mapped Libya's religious actors and their potential roles in peace building and countering violent extremism. This and many other things. In 2018, the Rockefeller Foundation named Zahra one of 5 women leaders introducing transformative change around the world. And I could go on forever. Zahra, take the floor.
I don't see Zahra on the list of panelists.
She is. Yeah. I saw her until a little while ago. She was.
I think she left Karim.
Okay. Then Nat, you wanna go? Nat is an associate professor and head of the Arabic program at George Mason University, a comparatist by training with interest in contemporary cultural productions, politics, and theory. He's wrote many books and many publications. He's presently pursuing several lines of inquiry into the confluence of technology, ideology, and power in the modern Middle East and North Africa. Can you hear me, Nat?
Nate, you're muted.
Nate, can you hear me? Yeah, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm here. Perfect. Sorry. Thank you.
No problem.
Are we giving up on Zahra? I'm no substitute. Hopefully she'll join us later. So I'm just entirely humbled to be here with this panel. Everyone here is doing such incredible work. I'm taking notes like mad and learning a lot, and it's clear that we have a lot to continue to write about and to reflect on. I'm going to attempt to do a PowerPoint in the spirit of academia. So let me start that up now. Are you able to see my screen? Are you all able to see my screen at this time?
No, it's not here, Nate.
Okay.
Is screen sharing turned on?
We prompted it before the meeting began, but it may have been turned off. That's okay. Okay, very good. Great, thank you. Well, so I'm talking about media, okay, and the post-revolutionary media landscape. There's little doubt that Libya's information ecosystem continues to be shaped by foreign and proxied agendas. The media is plagued by bad actors, false information, and strategic narratives. This may sound familiar to American audiences as well, by the way. Every several months, it seems, Facebook reveals another massive campaign of coordinated, inauthentic behavior being launched at Libya. And I'll discuss some of those shortly, but it's equally important to note that the country has seen, since the outset of the revolution, an unprecedented boom in media communications, with journalists and new media conglomerates taking shape as we speak. Already by 2013, There were believed to be 200 registered newspapers in the country, 20 TV channels, and 200 radio stations. The internet, which was introduced into Libya in 2001, provided at first little room for new media production or consumption, with the country's single provider, Libya Telecom and Technology, keeping a tight lid on things. But today there exists a veritable tsunami of internet users, and with them an increasingly unwieldy supply chain. Like everywhere else in the world, the dissolution of old media and the rise of new media is rapidly transforming the information ecosystem in Libya. This is significant because as we continue to learn in the US, the cacophony of the internet is exceptionally vulnerable to strategic interference. Echo chambers feed pre-existing biases, and easily manipulated algorithms serve motivated actors seeking to corner the truth. Understanding the narrative arc of information operations can help illuminate the intentions and in some cases the origins of disinformation, but a more heavily regulated media sphere, as well as dedicated investment in media literacy will, in my opinion, be of penultimate importance to the ultimate stabilization of Libya moving forward. Libya has been the target of multiple overt and clandestine influence operations over the past half decade. In August 2019, researchers for Facebook's Office of Cybersecurity released information concerning what they described as a massive online campaign of coordinated inauthentic behavior being directed towards a series of critical flashpoints across the Middle East and North Africa, Libya first and foremost. Although disguised as local news organizations, public figures, and average citizens from within the target countries, Facebook traced the operation to individuals in Saudi Arabia associated with the Saudi government and to two ostensibly private media groups located in Cairo and Abu Dhabi. A parallel, though technically separate, influence operation was conducted by Russia, and that was detected 2 months later. All of the faux Facebook and Instagram accounts used in that operation were administered from Egypt. More recently, just last month, researchers at Facebook uncovered yet another massive campaign of coordinated inauthentic behavior generated from accounts tied to Russia's Internet Research Agency, a name that should be familiar to most Americans. And this time with a clear line of emphasis on the empowerment of Saif al-Qaddafi. These sorts of revelations, while not surprising on the surface, are nonetheless disturbing. First and foremost, in my mind, these kinds of operations are rapidly eroding the viability of social media as a space for free expression and debate. Undoubtedly, that's one of their major objectives. But in Libya, that's a problem because Facebook today is the third most popular website in the country, following Google and YouTube. And it's also increasingly, like everywhere else in the world, the primary source for news consumption. This is true for the absolute majority of young news consumers in Libya and increasingly for the majority of the population overall. Some research supports the notion that satellite media and radio in particular remain quite important in Libya, but even these media are increasingly reliant on the internet for marketing as well as distribution. And in terms of influence operations, the lines between old and new media are blurred. Looking at Facebook, for example, 2 of the 3 most dominant pages, meaning those with the largest audiences, are also satellite news stations, and actually they're part of the same conglomerate, 218 TV. Based out of Jordan and broadcasting over Nilesat, the rise of 218 TV, which was founded by Hoda Sarari, is an important story, I think, in the history of post-revolutionary Libyan media. Unlike the Tripoli-based and Qatari-funded Al-Ahrar or the Benghazi-based Al-Hadith, 218 TV appears at least physically separate from the construed geographies of the conflict. In many ways built for online consumption, 218 is equally dominant on YouTube and being the second most popular YouTube channel in Libya after the gamer site Sofian. And 218's website on its own is among the 25 most popular sites in Libya. So while it operates primarily in the neutral space of the internet, 218 News definitely has slant. That's not unusual, of course, but in the free-for-all of news consumption and with the reality that Facebook and Google promote content that triggers polarized debate, an outfit like 218 can easily be amplified and manipulated to bolster the kind of transcendental and strategic narratives that we see in more naked fashion with the coordinated disinformation campaigns on Facebook. 218's most popular articles, according to Alexa Analytics, include a May 2020 article titled "Legal Action Underway Against Erdogan and Siraj Crimes in Libya," a September article titled "Italian Newspaper Russian Plane Transferred Saif Islam Gaddafi from Zitan to Moscow," and a July 2020 article titled "French Rafale Destroyed Turkish Air Defense System in Awatia Air Base, Source Reveals to 218 News." The sources for these articles include, quote, a number of human rights activists and political activists, quote, Corriere della Sera, and, quote, an informed source. The Corriere article in the original has a somewhat ominous title. And Kareem, forgive my Italian here. Nella Libia da dopo sarà spunta Saif Islam, il figlio de Gaddafi. In Libya, after Siraj, Saif al-Islam, the son of Gaddafi, appears. That article attributes its claim about Putin shuttling Saif al-Islam Gaddafi from Zintan to Moscow for confidential talks to, quote, sources from Tripoli. So in other words, this is not your gold standard journalism, but it's commonplace for the kind of hyperspeed mass distribution scale that characterizes the news cycle in the digital age, and especially in the midst of such unregulated spaces as Libya's digital ecosystem. Taken as a whole, these sorts of articles, which align unequivocally with the meta slant of the Emirati and Saudi media giants Sky News and Arabiya, or more acutely for that matter, Al-Ahram, the organ of the Egyptian state, which hosts huge volumes of reporting from the Kremlin's media behemoth Sputnik, may contribute to the fact that 218 TV falls within a specific echo chamber. Of the 5 sites whose audience most directly overlap with 218 TV, Al-Wasat, Marsad, etc., all include administrators or editors based abroad, either in Egypt, the UAE, or Jordan. Although usually without attribution, at least 4 replicate identical stories. The largest player in this echo chamber, Afrigate News, or Bouaba Africa, is run by a Libyan editor-in-chief who, following Kremlin state media, has said Russia is the key player for balancing Libya, that Saif Islam Gaddafi is the answer for, quote, stabilizing the country, and that Erdogan is on a mission to Turkify Libya through his Islamist proxies in Tripoli. This latter position was promulgated recently in the form of an interview with Sky News, and later translated and posted in a Sputnik article titled opaquely, Idlib, Libya, Turkey is following the lead of ISIS in the west of the country. 218 TV, for its part, echoes much the same line, featuring among its guests American experts, like we should say, like Mr. Pollack, who track a notoriously hard line on Turkey. But the problem here, in my view, is not that 218 or any other media outlet takes one slant or another, but rather that these outlets are bolstered, amplified, and fed by a complex web of foreign actors. And their interests may or may not reflect those of the Libyan people. Such proxy efforts are becoming increasingly common in the digital age. But as much as Americans were enraged in 2016 by revelations that faux citizens were feeding the public with imported narratives designed to empower a candidate whose interests and willingness to act abroad were conducive to the illiberalism of the Kremlin and allied authoritarian leaders, so too should Libyans be wary of outside influence, which in truth, we should say extends to the social media platforms themselves. Algorithms and discourse based on incendiary comments and flyby reporting do not reflect the region's culture of dialogue. In parentheses, I would say wholesale blocking, state monopolies, and censorship have run their course in the Middle East and North Africa, and no serious advocate of stability could rationally encourage a return to the days of Gaddafi, where dissidents flourished in the shadows like fungus. But the creation of a new constitution could offer a chance for striking balance, and I look for that moment, balance between free expression and accountability, privacy and responsibility. As I've said previously, a strong, if imperfect model exists for doing this, I believe, in Tunisia's high independent communication authority. At the very least, I hope those involved in bridging the future for this noble country will continue to take seriously the power of words, of the notion of ikra, to read, and of the power of ideas and images in shaping the past, not to suppress what media might reveal, invent, or promote, but to empower through transparency and patience and education, the work of the reader. This is an art form and a science, and I think both are within the reach of a future Libya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ned. You're really doing great work. I'm really impressed.
Thanks,
It's really important what you're doing, really.
I look forward to hearing everyone else's comments.
Sure. Thank you very much again. Zahra, are you back?
Zahra, can you unmute Zahra?
Zahra.
Yes.
Are you back? Very well.
Okay.
I already introduced you, so you can go ahead.
So thank you very much for inviting me for this important panel. It's exciting times indeed. It's the 10th anniversary, and the topic is really a tricky one that you've decided to give me to speak on. So I'll try my best. I think because the topic is on regional Islamism and the Libyan uprising. So I just want to stress a point that the what we call the Arab Spring is not a closed episode yet. And it's still an era for the entire region's history that is still ongoing. The 2010 and 11 uprisings were basically a culmination of prolonged crisis of legitimacy that preceded 2010 and 11 and has intensified up to this moment. We are basically today discussing the same issue of the crisis of political legitimacy. We all remember that people chanted that people demand the downfall of the regime, the Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, all of them. So the entire people in the region were basically calling for a new social contract. What happened over the past decade is that there were hopeful aspirations of the Arab uprisings have been violently suppressed either by militaries or militias in the region. A decade ago, like these days, we remember all that we were swept up in the excitement of the events as we were seeing young people coming out to the streets, the squares, and demanding dignity, justice, and dictators were toppled. Nothing about it was religious yet. So that's the scene back then, a decade ago, of the uprisings everywhere. If we want to specifically talk about Islamism, I think Islamism or political Islam and the future of Islamism, it's something interesting to further explore in the wake of the uprisings and a decade of the uprisings and what happened a decade ago. So it's interesting to explore the avenues of the continued expression of Islamism as a coherent political project in light of the mass mobilization, the resurgent state repression, and the destructive civil conflicts. There are definitely shifts in these movements in terms of the generation gap, in terms of the change of the ideology. I think I do believe that the question that you sent to me to address is how the Libyan uprising was shaped by regional Islamism. However, I think that what also needs to be addressed is how political Islam and Islamism is being shaped by the uprisings. And I don't see it, as I already said earlier, as a closed episode. I think it still is ongoing, and I think there are many challenges that Islamism is facing, and hence it's reshaping its discourse, whether it's becoming more so-called moderate or it's becoming further radicalized. And since we're talking about Libya, I will come to it. It's quite different, because the question was regional Islamism influencing Libya. The experience of Libya is quite different, and I will come to it, from the neighboring countries, namely Tunisia and Egypt or Morocco. But if we want to say any, there were striking effects of the Arab Spring that basically it dispelled the myth of the dominance of Islamism in MENA politics. For decades, Islamism had been seen as so prevalent that any major upheaval in the region would be seen as likely Islamist in character. But what happened in Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, it did not assume a religious language at all. Not even in Bahrain, where the conflict was had a sectarian aspect to it.
Okay.
Sorry?
I didn't say anything. Go ahead, Zah. Don't worry.
Okay. So yes, what we've seen in Nahda in Tunisia, that the Nahda is ruling, the brothers won the elections, then we've seen what happened in 2013. However, in Libya, it was completely different after the first elections. They did not even win a majority of the elections. Yes, what can be said about the uprisings is that an Islamist winter has been unleashed after the uprisings. And that also needs to be unpacked, of the kind of trends, ISIS and jihad, Salafi jihad, that developed after the Arab Spring. So I cannot go a lot through the differentiations, but what I can say is basically, even when we come to the politics of the regional Islamist movement, it tends to be more of the one during the 90s, after 2000 and after the uprisings, is neoliberal and not leftist, and different than the one we had of Muhammad Taha in Sudan and the others. So with the uprisings, Islamist movement there is an important aspect that we need to stress, which is that the secular religious analytical binary is misleading, especially after the uprisings. One can say that the post-uprisings developments highlighted the issue of what Asif Bayat and other scholars have said, the religionization of what is secular and the secularization of what is religious. And we've seen that with so-called liberal or secular movements using a religious discourse to combat political Islamist movement and becoming themselves politically affiliated with a kind of a political Islam, and Islamist movement becoming secular as in the politics of Nahda. I think, and there has become another aspect, the automization and the radicalization of Islamist movement. And if we come to this issue in particular, the atomization and the radicalization of Islamist movement, it's very much relevant to what is going on in Libya. As I was saying earlier, the experience of political Islam in Libya is sui generis, as some of the panelists were saying, even in political Islam, due to the lack of absence of large urban agglomerations and weakness of university institutions, the repressive nature of the Gaddafi regime, the nature of political Islamist movement in Libya was different. And their development of their politics after 2011 was different. And I would say it was automized and decentralized. And in this, and I would add that it was very much opportunistic. And in this regard, I'm not saying that it is different than so-called other secular politics, but the issue of ideology is not there, is not present as much as it is with other neighboring political Islamist movements. Yes, the regional politics, especially after 2013, 2014, the divorce between Salafism sponsored by Saudi Arabia and Muslim Brothers, especially in 2014, and we've seen how that affected the war between two camps, Karama and Fajr Libya, and the rise of the Mudkhalis. We've become, I do believe that it is only after 2014 that that there is now a literature on who are the Mudkhalis, and that they are also radical groups. Before that, before the divorce that happened between the Salafis, and I mean the Saudi regime and Ikhwan, that kind of literature was not there. Not saying that they are not part of radical political Islam, they are. But the regional politics is what affected that part. However, we've seen also that there are Mudkhalis with both camps, Karama and Fajr Libya. So, which tells you that even if there is an influence of regional politics on Islamist movements in Libya, it is to a certain extent, and that the role of local and decentralized and maybe regional in the sense Jihawi is more evident than that of regional Iqlimi in the region as a whole. So I think it is an open-ended question that needs to be seen both ways. The effect of the uprising itself on the discourse of Islamists and their the venues that they will choose to work and on. It will not be only the domain of politics, as in running for elections, but it will be further, and they've already in Libya, they have chosen the domain of militias. In other countries, political Islam has not have changed their, especially after the repression and becoming more radicalized and seeing that there is no hope in participating in the political institutions or elections, and rather opting to dismantle the nation state. So we've seen that they're developing a rather different discourse that is not state-centered. In Libya, it is the same, and it will be still interesting to observe, and to observe the counter narratives of political Islam. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you very much. Diane Kelly is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer with enormous expertise in the Middle East and North Africa. She has served in Hong Kong and Macau, Tunisia, Egypt. In Washington, she was the desk officer for China, North Africa, Egypt, and was Deputy Public Affairs Advisor for the Middle East and South Africa. Diane.
Yes. Thank you, Karim. And thank you, Hani, Dr. Hani, and Wolfgang, and Ed, for the invitation to join your panel today. I am pleased to be able to present a view from Tunisia of the 10th anniversary of the Libyan Revolution. 10 years ago, as everyone remembers, Tunisia ousted its own despot in a popular uprising which unified the country on its path to building a democratic state. Tunisian youth and adults were excited at the outset of the Libyan Revolution, feeling the Arab world was finally moving in a positive direction. So, when in late February 2011, Libyans fleeing attacks by Gaddafi forces surged across the border, Tunisians welcomed them, opening their homes and sharing their food, thinking the stay in Tunisia would be temporary. When the NATO intervention began, however, on March 17th and hostilities increased, overwhelming numbers of refugees arrived. They too were welcomed, as UNHCR rep in Tunis commented. He'd never seen such acts of generosity, despite the challenges Tunisians themselves were facing. Generally, Tunisians supported the Libyan Revolution, thinking it would turn the page on authoritarian rule and provide for calm on their own border, a source of concern under Gaddafi and afterwards. They did not encourage nor envision Western intervention or prolonged fighting and attacks. Tunisians preferred that Gaddafi be tried in an international tribunal rather than killing him in a vengeful manner, which caused further deterioration of the situation and led to chaos, rather than toward building a state based on the rule of law. Few Libyans, however, registered to become refugees, so it's difficult, particularly at the outset, to have an accurate count of Libyans who fled to Tunisia. It seemed that the poorer, more conservative ones stayed in the rural south of Tunisia, relying on continuing help from local Tunisians, who themselves were also struggling to feed, shelter, and care for their own families. Many richer and those closer to the Gaddafi regime seemed to be going to cities in Tunisia. Le Monde reported that by May 2014, there was an influx of 600,000 to perhaps as many as 2 million Libyans. By 2015, the next year, the Ministry of Commerce in Tunisia estimated 1.6 to 2 million Libyans were now living in Tunisia. This large surge, increasing the Tunisian population itself by 10%, was seen as a threat to the country's stability and capacity to absorb all of these newcomers. Though Tunisia is making difficult but steady progress on the road to democracy and social justice, it is not progressing economically. Tunisia's economy suffered from the theft of national wealth by Ben Ali and his family, as well as by lost trade, investment, and tourism. Banks lost irreplaceable revenues from remittances from those working in Libya who had returned. According to a Brookings study, 100,000 Tunisian workers returned from Libya. Their remittances represented 0.6% of Tunisian gross domestic product, 276 million US dollars in 2011. Unemployment remains high at 16%, and according to the same source, Tunisians complain about the rise in rent and strain on consumer goods and services, especially government subsidized goods. According to a 2017 World Bank report, 1/4 of the overall drop in Tunisia's GDP from 2011 to 15 can be attributed to the Libyan crisis. Terrorism, economic hardship, and COVID have reduced further the prospects for economic growth and spurred unprecedented social unrest since 2011. Wealthy Libyans moved to cities, especially Tunis, paying premium prices for housing and impacting the housing market for average Tunisians. Libyans brought economic benefits as well. Brookings research reports that Tunisian hotels, restaurants, private hospitals, schools, retailers, supply chains, and workers have profited from an estimated injection of as much as 1 billion euros annually into the Tunisian economy. Still, the public sector has taken on an added burden at a difficult time. The World Bank notes that Tunisia's economic resilience has been drained by several years of indecisive policies and a growing protectionist stance. There has been a sharp decline in growth compared with regional peers. In 2020, the economy contracted 9% and unemployment reached 18% in the second quarter. The conflict in Libya presents Tunisia with concrete security challenges as well. In response to escalating cross-border violence in 2011, the Tunisian military captured, disarmed, and returned Libyans, vowing to do whatever was necessary to protect Tunisia, tightening security in the border provinces of Medellin and Tatouine. Again in 2020, the government indicated it would deploy security and army units along the coast and the eastern border. Measures also had to be taken to prepare for possible terrorist infiltrations on Tunisian soil, they said. In 2011, there was, as you may remember, a general amnesty for prisoners in Tunisian jails. Islamists released from prisons and returning from exile backed the Islamist political party, Ennahda. Openly opposed by secular and leftist party, Ennahda won the elections and formed a weak and divided coalition government. Tunisian security officials expressed concern about the return to Tunisia at that time and the release from prison of jihadis, particularly Tunisian Salafist Saifallah Ben Hassin, also known as Abu Iyadh. Extradited to Tunisia by Turkey upon his release from prison in 2011, he founded Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, and within a year had drawn 30 to 40,000 youthful followers, according to the New York Times. He had close ties with Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, the group thought to be responsible for the 2012 attack on the US consulate in Benghazi, as has already been stated. Abu Iyadh staged attacks against the US Embassy and American School in Tunis in September of 2012. After two Tunisian leftist politicians were assassinated, allegedly by Abu Iyadh's followers in 2013. Ansar al-Sharia was designated a terrorist organization by the United States, United Nations, and Tunisia. The media reported that Abu Iyad was on the run at that point, and his preachers in the mosques had fallen silent. Later reports tell us that Abu Iyad was killed in 2019 in Mali. According to the New York Times and other media, a large number of Tunisian youth went to Libya to train to join Daesh in Syria. In 2011 and 12, they trained in Islamist military camps, and from there, from Libya, most were sent to fight with Daesh in Syria. Others were unleashed on Tunisia, where they attacked police and security forces, as well as tourist destinations in Sousse and the Bardo Museum, and the US Embassy in Tunis in 2015. They had been trained, they said, at the Islamic State camp in Libya. Many other attacks against security forces by Salafists and other extremists were thought to be conducted by infiltrators from Libyan training camps. Though the Tunisian military had long been concerned about the continued threat from Gaddafi's mercurial and aggressive regime, according to one Tunisian retired general, since 2011, extremist terrorism presents a strategic challenge of enormous impact to the Tunisian economy and stability, as well as its security. The security gap created after Ben Ali's departure in January 2011 was rapidly filled by the popularly respected professional Tunisian military, who played a number of roles from law enforcement to guarding critical infrastructure, to disaster relief. But extremist terrorism coming from Libya requires a focus on asymmetric threats and new strategies, as well as re-equipping and re-educating military and security forces. According to a Carnegie report, the challenges from Libya have exposed deficiencies at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of Tunisia's defense capabilities. Rather than attempting to analyze these issues at this time, I simply want to point out that an international support effort is required, working with the Tunisian military and security establishments to find and implement new ways to combat terrorists and secure Tunisia's borders. A stable and effective government and an economic recovery coupled with social justice are also necessary to bolster defense and provide jobs and buy-in from Tunisians, especially their youth. I mention these issues because I think they also matter in Libya's security and stability. As that country may progress, it will want to have stable neighbors on both sides. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Diane. Thank you very much. General Mohammed El-Keshki is a decorated military veteran and an innovative and seasoned leader and diplomat with extensive experience in foreign relations, diplomacy, and strategy. His most recent position at the end of a distinguished career in the Egyptian army was Deputy Defense Minister for External Affairs. Among his many positions and many high-level services, he has been a military attaché in Washington, D.C. from 2009 to 2013, where he was elected to lead the Military Attaché Association in Washington, D.C. He was awarded the Legion of Merit from the President of the United States, making him the only Egyptian foreign national ever awarded this honor. He received the Order of the Republic Award from the Egyptian government, as well as a number of other awards. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. I'm sorry for this technical problem. Do you hear me well? Is that
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
And thank you, Dr. Hani and Wolfgang, and my great excellency sister, Diane Kelly. I miss you all from a long time ago, from our classmate. Regarding Libya issue, the Libyan geopolitical scene has produced unusual challenge, conflict, and alliance, which resulted in a state of confusion, insecurity, and incompatibility in handling the crisis, which is reflecting the position of other countries interfering in Libya. It also resulted in internal division within major state and on the international level as well, all of which made the suggested solution application more difficult. To help to paint the picture in generally, Libya, as you know, extends over 1.8 million kilometers and has a common border with 6 countries, including 2 African states, Chad and Niger, as well as 4 African Arab states, Algeria, Tunisia, as Diane mentioned, and Sudan, and Egypt, which shares the longest border with Libya, 1,200 kilometers. Egypt also plays a major role regarding the Libyan crisis due to its prominent Arab and African regional role, as well as the Mediterranean basin, all of which has placed a heavy burden on Egypt, especially during the Libyan crisis, which started in 2011. At the beginning, what increased the scale of Libyan crisis was the regional situation that started the whole region, and among its financial tools were the terrorist organization. This organization exploited cases in popular anger, mostly within Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Sudan, which are not only the main regional power with common border with Libya, but also have real influence due to geographical and historical factors. Since 2011, the NATO have been bombed and destroying Libya and exit Libya without a clear or planned strategy, resulting a chaos in Libya and the million, according to the United Nations report, maybe 15 million weapons in the hand of the gang and the Libyan. And also the African Union report mentioned about 21 million pieces of weapons in the hand of the people. These weapons have been leaked from Libya to several African states. All this was combined with a breakdown of armed gang and the terrorist organization within a number of states. In addition, these unlawful gangs were stationed on the common Libyan border, causing a chaos along with this border, which allows a transfer and transmission and contacts among a terrorist organization based outside Libya, such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Sahara associated with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Maghreb. Finally, the domestic terrorist organization and the international gang surfaced. They were specialized in natural wealth theft and human trafficking. It estimated size gang between 30 to 35,000 armed elements. Even sometimes when I went to the NATO for some meetings, the NATO mentioned it's 70 or 80,000, but all of this number is wrong. All of this element and mainly aimed at striking stability in the region, as well as conducting continuous chaos under religious, political, and ethnic claims. The complex situation in Libya was intensified by the international conflict between historical contenders of the Libyan land. There is too many chefs and the cooker on the kitchen that this cause spoil the meal. It destroys the meal. And the French-Italian interaction took a new form in Libya after emergence of the new competitor. Turkey appeared during the chaos in Libya and played the role to gain a foothold, thus reinitiating the Turkish economic ambitions. With the emergence of such threat, relation between Rome and Paris took the form of alliance and economic coordination in the southern Mediterranean, but later the intensity of the historical power struggle between them in Libyan south was amplified after the Italian-Turkish-Qatari alliance was formed, whose feature appeared in the reformulation of the crisis in southern Libya, in coordination with the French security vision and the threatening of its national security through the flow of the illegal immigration from Africa to southern Europe from the Libyan coasts, as well as threatening the economic security represented by its oil investment in Libya through Total, company Total, which investment exceeding 33% of Libya oil. One of the main negative factors that influenced the Libyan crisis was the ineffectiveness of international community to address the issue seriously and exert sincere effort to reach a just settlement to this extremely important crisis, which affects the welfare of the Libyan people, its neighbor, the Middle East region, and the whole world. Unfortunately, this indecisiveness lead to the escalating of the crisis and interference of different actors like Turkey in Libya, which resulted a new challenge and made it more difficult to reach a just and fair peaceful settlement in the brotherly country. On the other hand, and it's well known that the different actors that interfered in crisis were seeking to achieve certain privilege, militarily, economically, etc., at the expense of the welfare and interest of Libya people who suffered greatly as a result of this extremely unfortunate crisis. On the other hand, Egypt and its institution, in the face of this negative development and contradiction, has dealt with flexibility and goodwill regarding our brotherly country, Libya, through the combination of political, diplomatic, security, and the military focus in order to reach a just settlement that will benefit all the Libyan people equally. Cairo has adopted its main step in resolving the crisis in Libya by taking action at all levels, domestic, regional, and Arab and international level, by detecting and dismantling project imposed in Libya. It based its contribution on the historical and the humanitarian principle and on the support of Libyan legitimacy institution nested under the umbrella of international legitimacy. The principle of non-intervention in Libya are firmly rooted in the internal Libyan, such as Libyan National Army, tribes, civil society, and the moderate opposition forces, which are not aligned with the terrorist organization. The increase in Turkish tempering and the non-compliance with the relevant international resolution concerning Libya, which require non-interference in the internal affairs of state and arms embargo, affirmed the Turkish continuous disrespect for international legitimacy. Cairo declared its readiness to intervene militarily in accordance with the legitimacy supported by the request of the Libyan parliament and the Libyan tribes. Moreover, the Libyan National Army requested from the political leadership in Egypt as a representative of the Arab Project and its army parliament and the League of Arab States to activate the joint defense agreement with Libya as it is threatening by foreign invasion target its Arabism. Cairo immediately responded to the Libyan and the Arab demand calling on Turkey to stop fueling the war in Libya and allow the Libyan to find the solution and set the stage to resume peace and withdraw its mercenary. All the aforementioned reasons were not to evolve into the threat to the Egyptian and the Arab national security lined by the border of Sirt al-Jafra, known as the Red Line, which is a watershed that had helped to set the record straight and make room for Libyan solution. The United Nations in Libya has announced that the Libya Forum had elected the Libyan new interim government, as we know, Mohammed ibn Moufi and Dabeiba, and these people to get new elections, the parliament and the presidential in the next December. Egypt has the basic condition for this, for developing the relation between Cairo and the new authority in Libya. That is not to allow militia and the mercenary to return to Libya and penetrate it to destabilize the Egyptian national security. And I'm just sorry if I'm getting more, or I'm in the right time. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Thanks a lot. At this point, we are out of time, so I would give back. I thank you all of you. It's been extremely interesting. Hope we're going to have some more discussion later on. I'll pass the word to Wolfgang or to Hani, whoever wants to take hold the reins for the next panel. Thank you very much, all.
Well, thank you, Karim. I think we've had a very interesting discussion in that panel, and we've heard some interesting comments that are made in this panel. And before I move to the next panel, I just wanted to ask two questions, if you don't mind, Karim. One of them is to Zahra, if Zahra is still there. You mentioned the Madkhalis, and the Madkhalis are present in both camps of the conflict. How do you rate their influence? Are they really very influential on both conflicting areas in Libya today? And how do you rate it? Is it a sort of a mild, moderate, or very marked influence in the process that we are expecting in the future? And will you see them as positive or negative effectors in the reconciliation process that we are witnessing today?
Thank you, Hani. I do see them as part of radical political Islam. And I do believe that in the literature on political Islam, and particularly on Mudkhalis, they tend to see them as not part of political Islam. And I do see them as part of political Islam because they do weaponize and instrumentalize religious text for their own political interests. So we do have like a political theology that is based on paying allegiance to the ruler and waging war against jihadist or another form of political Islam or opponents of the state, and others who have who tend to believe in a political theology that is based on rebellion to the state. So one is based on obedience to the state or the ruler, and one is based on the rebellion to the ruler. So, I do see them as a radical and definitely as a negative aspect in Libya. Not to say that their opponents are any better or less radical or anything like that. And as I was saying earlier, when it comes, and particularly, I have written about this in my study that is published with the USIP, they tend to be more decentralized and more opportunists. And this is a common trait that you will find also with other political Islamists or jihadists in Libya. So I do think, and especially now in Libya, they are challenging and waging war not only against another forms of political Islam and specifically Muslim brothers. They are their war now is against members of civil society, what they call secularists. So they are an aspect that needs to be addressed. However, what I see in Western literature lately is a focus on Mudkhalis in favor to other groups. So that needs to be balanced.
Well, that's going to be a very interesting conversation to be held on its own. How do you tame this lion, and how do you bring it to a reconciliation process in a positive way rather than a confrontational way? I have a question very quickly to Diane. Diane, speaking of Tunis and how it is influenced by Libya and influencing Libya, how do you see the foreign intervention in Libya, whether it is Turkish, French, Italian, or other influencing how Tunisia, which has very important relations with the above countries, Turkey, France, and Italy, designing its own policies vis-a-vis Libya. I mean, it's a very fine line they are walking. How do you see that?
I see two questions in your question. First of all, I think that Tunisia prides itself on the fact that it does get along with those other outside authorities, countries, foreigners. What the Tunisians do not recommend for any country in North Africa is that they let other countries make their policies for them or control their futures. Tunisians are innately fiercely independent people. And by that, I mean their experience under the French and under the Turks makes them very much aware that outside forces are not necessarily going to help you. They can complicate things greatly. I think that sometimes they've actually turned down assistance from the outside because they want to do it genuinely and authentically themselves. I believe, and we read the article, by the way, this morning in the New York Times, both my husband, who is Tunisian, and I, and we are hopeful that Libya will soon find its way, whether it has a broker to help bring people together, such as this interim prime minister. But neither one of us sees the future as something that will be given to them by the United Nations or by Turkey, certainly not, or by Russia, certainly not. Everyone is involved in Libya today because they see oil there. They see ways that they can profit or get in on the business side. Tunisia sees it as a matter of Libyans having the opportunities that they Tunisians took to create their own system. And sometimes you're going to make mistakes, but they'd like to see them genuinely do it for themselves. And they believe that they can do it too. That's the difference.
Thank you, Diane. I have a question to Nate. I mean, there's a lot of focus on foreign intervention in Libya and how it is negatively influencing the political process, the state building, efforts to reconcile, and so on. And the focus is primarily on machinery, weapons, money that is coming in, and so on. But you bring in a very important element, and that is the influence of the media, which in Arabic, sometimes we say the words are much more influential and destructive sometimes than weapons themselves. So the question to you is, assuming that the international community really wants to limit international influence in Libya, what can be done, particularly in the area of media restriction and influence on Libya?
Thanks, Dr. Hani. Yeah, I mean, this is a question really that applies around the world right now. I mean, this is not unique to Libya, this problem. I tend to be gravitating towards the side that, we can't move back to a time of blocking censorship, that kind of extreme regulation in that regard. But I think that there needs to be some kind of an international consensus, first of all, in terms of putting pressure on some of the social media companies that allow for anonymity in particular, I think is a real problem. So I think there needs to be much more transparency, and I imagine that the Biden administration, as well as many other governments, will be advocating for something along those lines. But also, I think that we can invest in media literacy, and education. I think that's extremely important in terms of integrating media literacy into early education platforms. And unfortunately, I don't think you can let once the genie is out of the bottle, I don't think you can put it back in the bottle, whatever that expression is. But I think that there can be a concerted effort to integrate into possibly the constitutional process, some additional measures for a degree of regulation, certainly, and I mentioned the High Independent Communication Authority in Tunisia as a possible model, and thinking really of something, thinking checks and balances and something outside of the official apparatus.
We've seen, Nate, we've seen how corporations can actually shut off Twitter,
right?
Kind of access to a president.
Right.
Are these basically things that can actually be executed at a Libyan level in a more effective way and not just a random?
Right. I mean, I think we're seeing it happen in degrees. I mean, Facebook is taking down some of the coordinated and authentic behavior, but really, it's not just the fake accounts and all that kind of stuff. What we're seeing now is authentic communicators, journalists or reporters who might have a position, might have a slant, which is fine, but that's being amplified and then projected towards vulnerable populations who will be susceptible to that kind of messaging. So we see this particularly in advance of military campaigns. I mean, in advance of the April assault on Tripoli, there was a huge front, a media front that preceded that. And, so I don't think that, I mean, this is developing, I think, as we speak in terms of like cyber defense in the bigger picture. But long-term, I think the easiest thing to do is to really invest in education and media literacy for the youth. So people understand when they're consuming and sharing and absorbing information that they have certain basic tools to discern where that information is coming from and who it stands to benefit.
Well, unfortunately, that level of knowledge does not necessarily exist at a wider range in Libyan youth today, and that's an educational process.
And not anywhere.
Unfortunately. Mohammed Keshkari, you talked about Egyptian, Turkish interests in Libya, influence in Libya, some agreements, some understandings. Is there any chance that the Turks and the Egyptians can actually align their policies in a way that would ultimately be helpful to the Libyans in deciding their future and so on, notwithstanding each one's interests and strategic depth interests and business and commercial interests and vision long term and so on? Is there any hope that these would actually be tamed in a certain way whereby Libya will actually start a process that is its own without influence?
Thank you, Dr. Hani, for this great question. But let me be more honest. The Libyan problem, it's the Libyan people. The only people who are able to solve this problem, it's the Libyan, not the Turkish, not the Egyptian, not the French, not the Italian. The people who are leading the Libya, or they believe they leading the Libya, everyone he get some privilege, some power, some authority. So some country gives this privilege to some people. For example, the people, I don't want to mention any people, I don't want to mention any particular area in Libya, I don't want to make a connection between, for example, Musrata and the Turkish and the East who connected with this and the West who connected with that. These people, if they don't, the Libyan people, if they don't look for their own benefit, for their people who are suffering, Libya is a very wealthy country. Every country who are interfering in Libya, he looking for Libya from his own benefit, not from the Libyan people benefit. Everyone looking for his national security issue, not for the Libyan. So we don't like to mention any particular country. If we say this country who is going to do this good, and the Libyan issue will be fixed. We all hope the election will be running in next December, and we have a real government, and we have a real solution coming from the Libyan people. That's it. Thank you, Dr. Han.
Thank you. Karim, as the head of this panel, I leave it up to you to make the final comment and any questions that you'd like to raise. Karim.
Thank you very much, Hani. I think everything has been said, and I really think it's getting very late for the next panel to begin. We had already some defection, so I'd rather leave it as well and move on to the next. Look as interesting as this one.
Very good. Well, we're going to be moving to the next panel, will be chaired by Edward Joseph. And Edward has been with the council as executive director and I'm a member of the board for many years now. He is very well known for his articles and publications and studies on conflict resolution, particularly in the Balkans. And he is no stranger to the Libyan file. He's been with us for many years. Edward, I'd like you to start sharing the session. And I want to also have a special thanks to Wolfgang Postai, whose idea was to establish this whole panel and this whole symposium today on the 10th anniversary. He was able to assemble fantastic speakers, and I owe it to him that he actually structured this whole thing. Edward, are you there?
Thank you, Dr. Shanib. And let me take a moment here to salute you, Hani, for your vision, your leadership as the founder of the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations, and someone who just recently returned from Libya after conducting a humanitarian operation there in Tripoli. Hani, I wanted to salute your leadership and underscore what you said about Wolfgang, who is responsible for putting together today's event. And I really have to credit Wolfgang with assembling this wonderful panel. And I certainly hope we have a lot of participants still with us here, because this is about what you do with that learning that we got from the previous panel, that retrospective look 10 years after the revolution. Now it's time to apply that. And that's the focus of this panel, applying the lessons and consequences of the revolution, taking the opportunity of this look back on the 10th anniversary to today's, applying it to today's Libya at this critical juncture. And what Wolfgang has done here is assembled not just a team of experts, but really he's covered the range of issues. So we'll begin with Wolfgang looking at the immediate aftermath and some of the security and political dynamics that have created the situation, this fundamental tension that we have today, that this UN effort is attempting to bring to a halt, at least. And then Dr. Shanib will take a look at the regional dimension of the conflict and explore whether the old constitution, you remember Dirk van der Wal mentioned that one of the problems is whether Libya was ever a modern state, whether there was the question of the imagination, of whether there is a common imagination of a state. And Hani has been at the forefront of raising the question of reviving the old constitution, the last time that there was a common imagination about what the state is, which in many respects, that's what a constitution is. So we'll look at that. We'll look with the aid of Dr. Mansour El-Kihia. We will look at the role of tribalism in Libya, a central question. And then with Dr. Otman Gajiji, we'll look at elections, particularly local elections, and see if that is an avenue. Instead of the constant struggle at the central level, will local elections perhaps be an avenue, more promising avenue for stability? And finally, last but not at all least, Dr. Mohsen Deregia, former head of the Libyan Investment Authority, will look at the economic aspect of this. So we really are covering it all. And Wolfgang, I begin with you, and just quickly to introduce you, also widely known, I'm sure, to our panelists, and equally important, widely known as one of the world's leading and most consulted experts on Libya, who brings both military and political security and intelligence expertise to the topic, graduate of the University of Vienna in political science, and also the National Defense University, National War College in the US. And finally, Wolfgang, let me mention that he was defense attaché on the ground in 2011 at this time as we look back, and the author of many publications and analyses, and I've had the honor of co-writing with Wolfgang. Wolfgang, please take the floor.
Edward, thank you very much for your kind words. Actually, 10 years ago on this day, I was just preparing for the evacuation of Austrians and Europeans from Tripoli. So, and now it's time, 10 years later, to have a look on the revolution, the aftermath, and the civil war, and to explain a little what went wrong from my point of view. At the beginning, in fall 2011, actually, it looked quite good. Libya appeared to be on the path to stability. There was a group of highly educated politicians in charge. But very soon an ever steeper downward slide into chaos set in. So what went wrong? Let me have first a look on the UN mandate, which mandated the international intervention in Libya. Actually, the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian populated areas under the threat of attack in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. There was not a single word about regime change or toppling the Gaddafi regime. Nevertheless, it was very clear almost from the beginning that the intervening countries could not allow the Gaddafi regime to survive. If Gaddafi would have survived, even in a part of the country, he would have been subject to the international community, would have been subject to the dictator's revenge. He would have sent migrants in the thousands, you can say they are already here in Europe, and he would have certainly sponsored terrorist groups. So it was quite clear that Gaddafi needs to fall, that he needs to disappear. Nevertheless, the military strategic objectives did not mirror this. They mirrored the political guidance. And NATO jets continued for months to bomb tactical targets on the battlefield, instead looking on the strategic objective of the campaign. Only in early August, they changed the focus and cut off Tripoli from the rest of the country by facilitating the revolutionaries to take the coastal road and to cut off the road to the south in Garian. The fall of the capital thereafter was a matter just of 2 weeks. So the mismatch of the political statements and the real military objectives and the real strategic objectives extended the length of the campaign by months. And by this contributed to the divide within Libya. For efficient warfighting, that's a lesson. The political guidance must be in line with what is the real strategic objective on the ground. And in Libya, this was not the case from the very beginning. In the immediate aftermath, there was no international supervision. And right now, many people ask why there was no international supervision. But looking back, in hindsight, this was quite clear. The Libyans did not show any interest in the major international mission. And NATO and the European Union had, after Afghanistan and Iraq, no real appetite for another adventure in a Muslim country. So altogether, the international community also lived in the wrong assumption that Libya was well prepared for its future, keeping in mind all the experts and politicians returning to the country. They have overlooked that the first generation of Libya's new politicians did not have lasting support within Libya. They disappeared within months, together with many of the experts. They have overseen the negative impact of the century-old tribal conflicts, the chaotic Gaddafi administration, and regional divide. The next important step was that the Constitutional Declaration of August 2011 set an entirely unrealistic timetable for transition. This exaggerated expectations and corresponding, of course, disappointments. The participation in the elections decreased over the years. In 2012, euphorically celebrated by the international community and the Libyans, just 44% of those eligible to vote voted. In 2014, it was only less than 20%. And during the recent round of local elections, Dr. Otman Gacici will talk about this in detail, the voter turnout was at about 20%. Today, we have additional problems because of obvious repeated cases of obvious election fraud. And we have cases where honest citizens who informed the police in confidence about irregularities during the elections were threatened along with the families. None of these elections were properly monitored by international observers. And the problem of the very low participation and the irregularities is still ignored by many. So I would like to ask what can be expected from the next general elections in December 21. The Libya Political Isolation Law passed by the GNC in May 2013 under massive coercion from several Tripoli militias. The outcome was everyone who had even semi-important positions with the Gaddafi regime at any point since 1969 was banned from any political activity for 10 years. And this included President Mohammed al-Maghariev, the elected president of the GNC. He was elected in 2012. He survived at least 3 assassination attempts. He founded the first armed resistance movement against Gaddafi. He was sentenced for several times to death by Gaddafi. But in the 1970s, he was just for 3 years ambassador to India. Enough that he got banned under the political isolation law. Actually, Islamist groups were among the main promoters of this law. One could say that their obvious goal was to eliminate many dangerous and successful political competitors with one blow. I would say they succeeded. And the country, the political isolation law deepened the country's divisions, a lasting contribution to the further destabilization. Let me at the end also briefly have a look on the Shkirat process. The selection of the participants to the negotiations in Shkirat, Morocco, was not appropriate for the not an appropriate representation of those who had actually the real power on the ground. They did not include the militias in Tripoli. They did not include many in the east and in the south. International media and diplomats cheered the agreement, but we know the outcome. The UN Security Council endorsed it already a couple of days after it was signed in December 2015. Before the Libya's House of Representatives, which was foreseen to endorse the agreement, had even a chance to vote on the agreement. And I would say this is probably quite unique in the history of UN, that we have a country with a government which is internationally recognized, but has no legitimacy within the country whatsoever. One could blame, of course, the HOR for not endorsing the government of national accord. But actually, from their point of view, they had no real reason to do so. Because they said, we don't want to be governed by an administration sitting in Tripoli on the mercy of the local militias. Also one point. My conclusion is, it does not make sense to establish a peace process excluding those who are really in charge on the ground. You may like them or not, you need to include them. The United Nations and the European Union actually tied their own hands by the unconditional recognition of a government which never ever had any kind of legitimacy under Libyan laws. To conclude, yes, the international community had its share in the negative developments in Libya after the revolution, but so had the Libyans. I've heard in 2011 in fall frequently statements like we will be richer than in Dubai and in Qatar. But this is not really a serious plan for securing and rebuilding a country after the revolution. I've said the international community was not really aware of the differences between the regions and the century-old tribal conflicts. The Libyans were, and they ignored them. They have seen the developments in Iraq after the impact of the de-Ba'athification process and did the same. So I would say at the very end, prior to support the opposition in any country, like we have seen it in Libya, this would need to be conditioned on the consent on an international stabilization mission after the war. And if possible, such an international stabilization mission should be led by a UN High Representative with far-reaching powers, like it happened in the 90s in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Thank you for your attention.
Very well. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. When we come to questions, I will look to you and your expertise in security to say maybe a little bit more about those militias in Tripoli and how it came to be that in the West, in Tripoli, militias came to be such a factor and foundation of security where not so much in the other part in the east, in Cyrenaica, where you had a different security dynamic emerge. So maybe when we get to questions, Wolfgang, you might illuminate that. Now we'll turn to Dr. Shanib. Let me introduce Hani formally to you. Dr. Hani Shanib is the founder and the chair of the National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. And let me sum up Hani in this way. He's truly a Renaissance man. He is both an internationally recognized cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon, and as well a leader on healthcare policies, as well as on foreign policy. And Hani has had many awards and distinctions. He's been a participant in the Middle East World Economic Forum, received other acknowledgments. He is also widely consulted as a regional healthcare model expert. And as I mentioned, Hani just himself recently returned from Tripoli, where he led a humanitarian mission there, bringing much needed equipment and establishing programs in Tripoli that will address and help in concrete ways the citizens of Libya. So without further ado, Hani, please, the floor is yours to speak to us about the old constitution and the regional dimension to this Libyan conflict. Please, Hani.
Well, thank you, Ed, for the generous introduction. I really don't deserve this, but I'm a person that is practical by nature. I believe that you don't approach something unless you know that you can actually finish it successfully, and that's the nature of our practice as heart surgeons. We don't venture into something unless we know that it is possible to do it successfully and completely. And the one thing that one observes in many of the solutions that have been proposed over the last 10 years in the course of trying to heal Libya or re-engineer it again is the fact that quite often proposals and solutions and processes that have been implemented have not had very distinct endpoints, more of wishful expectations and processes that even scientifically, when you look at them and you refer to literature, whether in greater institutions like Stanford and Harvard and Princeton and so on, as they analyze the work of the United Nations and the product of a lot of agreements, they recognize the weaknesses and challenges that come right after signing agreements. And as many know, we kind of observed the Herat Agreement, and we now are looking at a process that started in Berlin, has great expectations and hopes, but then we now are seeing ourselves rushing into sort of an executive entity that is supposed to be bridging Libya towards an election. And then the next question becomes an election to what? What exactly are we building? On what constitutional basis are we referring all these things? I think there is so much pressure on individuals, on groups, on entities in Libya to try and resolve the conflicts that exist and have been festering for many, many years, at least if one brings them back to 42 years when Gaddafi came to power, but also within the last 10 years. What is missing in all of this is rule for the game to be played. What exactly are we playing with? I mean, whether it is backgammon, chess, or designing a plan or a strategy for a country, what are the references that we have to ultimately achieve the objectives that we are all aiming for? And if you look at what has happened in the last two months in the course of bringing together 75 people and giving them the challenging burden of creating a new interim executive body, you will find also that what was looming and glooming around all this is the lack of a constitutional definition of where you're going to be ultimately arriving to. And you can see that there were some parallel discussions that went on. A proposal to at least go to referendum with a constitution that was proposed, and we all know the story of how that constitution emerged, the differences that were seen among the designers, the 60 people that sat down and tried to design the new constitution, the challenges, the hard times, the conflicts that were influencing the process of creating this constitution. And then we ultimately came up with a sort of a very questionable model of a constitution that is now being proposed for referendum in December. You can see that there's a lot of resistance, primarily by those who really were not satisfied with not just the political process, but also the frame, the structure that is proposed within this constitution for the country's future, what it is going to look like. Is it a republic? Is it a state? Is it a kingdom? Is it one state? Is it three states? You see the confusion even when the design of the executive board that is being internally proposed now, and that they basically endorsed the historical model of the three state representation, and that is the classic Cyrenaica, Tripoli, and Fezzan, that was entrenched in the dialogue. It was entrenched in the recommendations of how the country will be ruled in the next 10 months by designing the head of the presidential council being from Cyrenaica, the prime minister from Tripolitania, and then the Fezzan role in the House of Representatives and so on. So very, very confusing, very, very vague. The vote on a constitution that will be coming in requires at least 50% of each of the classical provinces to vote on it. I personally have very serious concerns that unless we address the issue of the constitution in a very different way, the sooner we do this, the better, because the likelihood of it going to a referendum and passing is questionable, because it does not address grievances and so on that have been surfacing for the last 52 years between the provinces and the distribution inequality among them. So I do not want to take a lot of time, Edward, on this subject, but there's clearly, when we reference the original Constitution of 1951, 1963, there are so many points that have been omitted in this new Constitution, while there is so much talk and referencing of the traditional foundation of the country as three states merged together for exactly the same reasons in the conflicts that existed today, many of it, and that is the formation of a federation between the three states. So that is a very long topic. We're running a little bit late on this panel, and I would like to pass it on to the other speakers so we could address other equally important matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hani, I just wanted to say, again, by way of comment and later potentially question, is when you talked about this crucial point here, because this is how is Libya going to attain stability? The only way is to deal with the various grievances, the word you use, the various grievances. These grievances are manifested in various ways. We'll hear now about the tribalism. You talked about the regional grievances which exist. And when the only other point to mention is that what Dirk van der Wal led off with, saying, how did he characterize the Libyan state? Distributive. And it's distributive of oil wealth and of political power. And Hani, what you're alluding to is something essential here. If this country is to become stable, is that distributive role. There have to be rules of the game for that. And there has to be redress for regions, not in Tripoli, the two regions, not Tripoli, Cyrenaica and Fezzan, that they feel that they get their fair share of distribution of not just wealth, but political power and influence. So
I have to say something also, because having
Please.
visited the two places just last week,
Yes.
the grievances extend not only just to Cyrenaica and Fezzan, but also in Tripoli. Tripoli
Yes.
is also, as a whole state or province, if you will, is struggling a lot. I mean, the inheritance that Gaddafi has left on the whole country is hurtful to the population everywhere, whether it's in Cyrenaica, Fezzan, or Tripolitania.
Very well, Hani. So actually grievances in all three regions, in fact, to address. And now we go from this regional dimension and the possibility of the Constitution being, the old Constitution being the unifying element, we go to the tribal dimension. And for that, we turn to Dr. Mansour El-Kikia, who joins us from Austin, Texas. And we should be additionally grateful for Professor Professor El-Kikia's participation here. We hope that you're reasonably warm, Dr. El-Kikia there, and that you're not freezing in the cold there. We know it's been rather difficult. By way of introduction, Dr. El-Kikia is a full professor at the University of Texas in political science and geography, specialization in comparative politics, international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and of course, Middle Eastern politics. He is the author of the book, Libya's Gaddafi, Politics of Contradiction. Please, Professor El-Kikia, take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's fascinating listening to all these scholars talking about Libya and giving their opinions, which I think are very, 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 very valuable indeed. If possible, I want to take a different path altogether. And I will talk about tribalism, no doubt about that. But to me, what is happening in Libya today is normal. This is what happens as a result of chaos. What happens in Libya, what's happening in Libya today, is a result of 40 years of dismantling the state. You know, what Dr. Van der Velde said earlier on was in fact brought to my attention by a colleague, Dr. Abdeslam Badr, when he said to me, we were talking one day about Libya, and he said, I want to ask you a question. Did Libya ever have a state? Did we ever have a state in Libya? And I got thinking about this. No, I don't think Libya ever had the Westphalian mode of a state, perhaps a faux state, but we never really developed a state in the real sense of the word. The monarchy after 1951 began a process, and talking about the constitution, which Dr. Hani talks about, was phenomenal. It was the bright individuals, of scholars doing constitutional work were the ones who formed the Libyan constitution. And Libya was moving towards that. It was laying the foundation for the state to emerge as a state. But unfortunately, it was cut short. With the revolution of 1969, the regime that came to power, led by Mr. Gaddafi, was a high school dropout, and of course his image was brightened up later on, but he was a high school dropout, and his knowledge was very limited to what a state is, how the system functions. And I don't think any of his partners, his co-conspirators in the revolution, graduated from university. I don't think so, but I might be wrong. Okay. But unfortunately, this is what we get from this type of system. I mean, so it's normal that we have the chaos that we have today. We have the lawlessness we have today. We have the paralysis that we have today. It is normal. To me, this is a normal outcome of the dismantling of 40 years of the state. Now, talking about tribalism, Libya, we know, is divided between 3 regions, okay? And I'm not sure, but I think maybe Cyrenaica has more tribes than the rest. Well, let's say more pronounced tribes than the rest, let me say. But tribes in Cyrenaica are more unified. And this is perhaps to answer your question our friend, to Dr. Wolfgang. Because they passed through a history of oppression under colonial rule, and they fought a war of for many years, from 1921 to 1931. More than half of Cyrenaica perished to Italian rule because they were in the concentration camps, and so it brought about a sense of unity in Cyrenaica, which you can't find in other parts of Libya, either in the west or the south of Libya. And so you have tribes in Cyrenaica, but you don't see tribes fighting against each other. You don't find Hassa fighting against Awagir. You don't find them. And hence, there's tribalism in Cyrenaica, and the monarchy was very, very smart in keeping peace between these tribes and giving them, as you quite rightly say, a distributive proposal, which they give them positions of authority, but the real movers and shakers of the government of things were not tribes, but actually educated individuals. This is why Libya moved very, very fast from 51 to 1969. It was unbelievable, the movement of history in Libya. You come to the West. The West, I think, has more tribes than the East. But the problem is not so much tribalism in the West. It has never been the problem of tribalism. The West has always been a problem of regionalism. So you have Misrata, which has a lot of tribes, does not like Beni Walid, which has also tribes. So you talk about regions, which doesn't like Warshfana, which does not like whatever it is, okay? And so what you have in the West, you have competition between regions. In the East, you have more competition between tribes, okay? But you don't find one tribe aggressor against another tribe. In the West, you do. In the West, this is very dangerous because one region, the dislike and the animosity between regions is so great in the West that they're willing to destroy each other. Look what Misratans did in Beni Walid, or what they did in Sirt, or what they did in Warshfana, and vice versa. Now you look at all this, the result of this, you see many of those militias in the West emerging from these different regions. So you find perhaps in one region 2 militias or 3 militias. So why? Because that militia says it protects that region against the other regions. In the West, I'm sorry, in the East, you don't have militias in the numbers that you have in the West. And as we'll see it, you have one militia, which is Haftar, okay, but not in the West. And this is the problem. With you have tribalism on one hand, but you don't have tribalism on the other hand. This is the dilemma that we're experiencing today in Libya as a result of this. Now, Gaddafi claimed that he didn't believe in tribalism. He claimed that. Yet he promoted certain tribes over others. For example, the Gaddafi, and not all the Gaddafi. The closest segment of the Gaddafis that he trusted to protect him, and those were promoted. The Gaddafis had the choicest positions in government, perhaps not as heads of governments, but as in the government positions. They made up the greatest number of his revolutionary committees, and so other tribes emulated that. They saw this. They knew they officially can't, because the regime looked down upon other tribes, but they also had their own way to react to that favoritism that Gaddafi manifested. And so, with the dismantling of the state, People had nowhere to turn to but their own tribes. They had no protection but their own tribes. When Gaddafi says, well, you take what Al-Bayt al-Sakini, who owns the house, gets it. Take out their homes. They could not do this in tribal regions. They couldn't do that because the tribe protected you, protected your property. The people living in the cities got the brunt of these rules and regulations. You go to Benghazi, you go to Tripoli. The city is not divided along tribal lines, not at all. On the contrary, you'll find that there's a mixture of everything. But outside the cities, yes, still very much along tribal lines. Very much so. As I said, in the West, it's regions. You have regions. Okay. In the East, it is tribes. But in the East, the tribes are not, and they're benign. They're not aggressive. Okay. In the West, regions are very aggressive. Tribes are not, but regions are. Okay. Against each other. And this is the problem. I mean, when you look at tribalism in Libya, it very much reminds me of ozone. And the stratosphere is very, 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 very beneficial. It prevents the earth from being the harmful sun rays. But in the wrong place, it becomes a poison. It becomes very dangerous. And what we're seeing today in Libya is the result of this chaos that has taken place and the dismantling of the state. People have nowhere to turn to but tribes. And it's and it gets to be sometimes ludicrous or even funny sometimes. For example, and Dr. Muhammad Dari is witness to that. In Egypt, we have the consulate in Alexandria, different from the embassy in Cairo. The consulate was headed by one tribe said, this is ours. This is our share. Okay. What are you talking? What share is this? What logic? What logic is there to say this consulate belongs to my tribe, or this company leadership belongs in my tribe? And this is the problem when you have no state. This is the problem with Gaddafi. 40 years of dismantling the state. There is no state. There is no authority. Leaves you back. So if you want to answer solution to Libya's problem, you have to go back 40 years. There's no way around it. You can't build on the swamp that we have today. There's no way of doing this, because ultimately you'll be caught. And what we're seeing, the return to tribalism, is again normal. This is natural. When there's aggression in the state or the false state, you see it, you have to start fresh. And so this is normal. What is happening today in Libya with tribalism, what's happening today with the breakdown of authority, it is normal. This is the result of the breakdown of the state and 40 years of repression, and the suppression and compression that you release all at once, you have explosions. And this is what we have today.
Thank you so much, Dr. El-Hihia. That was fascinating. You gave us a very clear paradigm to appreciate this condition, and it provokes many questions. Hopefully we can address. The first is this very realistic but bleak assessment that you have, and it's I appreciate it very much. You say this is normal, and that's I think it's really brings us in to the reality and how daunting this is. That this is the product of not having a state, and then the question is, how does Libya emerge then from this? How, as you use the metaphor of a swamp, that you have no ground, and so tribalism becomes the natural resort for people. Okay, so what of this agreement? What of these elections? How do these forces of tribalism and these fierce battles and mistrust between regions, as you say, in the West. And what Hani has always pointed out, Hani has pointed in the past to the fact that this civil war itself has created division, and not just military. And I've learned this from Hani, that there's been a physical separation that has taken place. That you have people, and you imagine younger people have not even interacted across these lines. And perhaps, who knows, maybe tribes in some way can be a factor, a positive factor, because some of these tribes reach across these divisions. So we'll perhaps, as we have time for questions, Dr. Al-Hiki, you'll continue to enlighten us. But thank you so much for that. And now we will turn to one of those avenues, potentially, to achieve what Dr. Al-Hiki was saying hasn't been done, to build a state, which is, of course, elected political power, to have elected officials that are chosen by the people. This is a democracy that are, in that sense, that are answerable and accountable, that compete openly for political power, not not with alternatives, but openly, and say, look, this is why you should vote for me, and whether those elections, particularly at the local level, rather than beginning at the national level, could be the way forward. And for that, again, we have really another truly leading expert, Dr. Othman Gajiji, both former chair of the High National Election Commission in Libya, and also the former chair of the Central Commission of Municipal Council Elections. And he is truly an elections and local governance expert, and holds his PhD in computer science, in fact, from the University of Bath in the UK. So please, Dr. Gajiji, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you see my screen? I have shared my screen with you.
Yes, we do. We see your screen. Please proceed. Beautiful.
Thank you very much for everyone that was involved in organizing this webinar and giving me the opportunity to talk about a different topic than the previous speakers, and it is related to the local elections and the legitimacy of the local elections. Libyans enjoyed municipal elections for the first time in 2014, where people went to the ballot boxes and selected their local representatives. People felt that they are in control of the available services through the elected officials. And you know, the municipal councils in the round one, which is in 2013, 2019, they were very happy to have local representatives elected. This year we will have the second round, which started last year, and we will be looking at 80 municipal councils that are scheduled to take place. The question that I will try to answer is, will the outcome of municipal elections affect the expected December national elections? This is a question, but I would like first to analyze a little bit to reach some valuable conclusions. Since we are talking about municipalities, I would like to just give a broad understanding of how Libyan municipalities work. Mainly, they are responsible for parks and open spaces, solid waste collection, street road maintenance, street lighting, but also they are not responsible for provision of electricity, traffic control, water supply, and sewage treatment. These other services are being run by a central public company, we call it the General Cleaning Services Company, which is not under the control of the municipal council. It is under the control of the Ministry of Local Government, and thus the mayors and municipal councillors do not have the powers to direct these companies to perform the services required. Municipalities in the first round faced a lot of administrative challenges and shortage of funding This has led to a movement into recognizing that we need decentralization, a number of attempts to transfer competencies from central organization to localities, and then we faced the problem of the capacity of the local institution to absorb the functions that they were managed and played from the center. Looking back to elections, we had two rounds of municipal elections, one in 2013 and one 2019. The main difference is that in the first round, it was an open list, whereas it is a closed list. Unfortunately, the number of municipalities grew from this period from around 100 to more than 120 municipalities. Voter registered are around 1.5 million, with the usual annual increase of the people passing the 18 years old. But this 1.5 is about half the eligible voters, which is an important indicator. When we conducted municipal elections in 2013, we had turnout better than the GNC, which was the previous election, because people felt very strongly motivated to cast their votes about to local authorities. In that period, there was a lot of confidence in the elected bodies. The turnout was around 58, 60%. Coming to nowadays, voter registration is almost the same with the usual additions, but we have noticed drastically a drop in the turnout of municipal elections so far, which were 40 municipalities, which represent the south and west. The east did not start yet. You know, we can see that it is one third of the turnout, which is a worrying sign for me. I mean, to move half in 4 or 5 years, it is very concerning. If we address this fall of turnouts and participation in the election process, we need to see what happened in the last number of municipalities, which we had court rulings nullifying the election results because of some mistakes taking or some problems in running the elections. But also there are some signs that there were some intimidation, ballot fitting, and people were not able to submit their complaints to the police stations. This issue is very worrying because if the voters cannot express their free will, and if something goes wrong, it cannot be adjusted, it cannot be reported so that the justice takes place, then it is a worrying trend that we are moving forward. Some of my interpretation for the low turnout is the performance of municipal councils. Municipal councils did not provide for the local services, or the quality did not improve. But this is not because of their own faults, the fault of the councils. This is also, the circumstances that the municipal councils are working, the legal framework, the funding. Most of Libyan municipalities were in conflict zone, either in the middle of the conflict zone or beside the conflict zone, where they had IDPs, where they had damage to infrastructure. So money was spent on returning or recreating the previous state of the structure. People are complaining. Yes, people are complaining. This is true. How we're going to improve this in the future? We need to improve the legal capacity constraints, which affects the performance of the municipal councils, planning for proving the municipal performance, but also cooperation with the central authority for decentralization. The way forward, we need to improve the local services so that participation will take place and will be increased. This will spill over into any national elections that will take place by the end of this year or later. The government of national unity has to support municipal elections, has to amend electoral regulations to make more inclusiveness or more people participation so that we increase the numbers. Municipal councils need authority to perform their services instead of waiting for decisions to be taken at a central level for actions or for services that could be handled locally. Thank you very much. This is for all from my side.
Very well. Dr. Gajiji, thank you so much for that presentation about the local elections and the potential there. Again, if we have time, I'm going to defer to Dr. Schneeb and to Wolfgang about the timing, but just to briefly comment and reflect on some of your views and some questions is for you, Dr. Gajiji, is aside from these difficulties that the municipalities have had, which you've laid out, we see that in fact, this, again, this distributive function of the center of the capital in Tripoli is still critical. There's no way around it. So the answer to the question of, well, we'll just get around all of this lack of a state and all these bitter fights over all the oil revenue and everything. We'll just get around that and work with these municipalities. The way I read what you're telling us is that only goes so far because the municipalities are not in charge of everything, and water and critical utilities is still, you're dependent on the center as it could be. How could one municipality control the entire power grid or water? It couldn't. So I take it that there's a limit to this, although there's some encouragement. So maybe later you could help illuminate how the role the municipalities potentially could play in advancing Libya through this crisis and to help it solidify this agreement that was just made. And finally, of course, to be complete, we can't talk about Libya or stability or the prospects for its citizens without talking, of course, about its economy. And for that, again, we have an ideal expert. This is Dr. Mohsen Deregia, who was formerly the chair of the Libyan Investment Authority, and not just the chair at a critical time, which in the immediate, very sensitive post-revolution period. And of course, when it comes to something like money, only someone who is highly capable and trusted could be put into such a position at such a highly sensitive time. And Libyans turn to Dr. Deregia for that role. And Dr. Deregia also is a PhD in finance, and in addition holds an MBA. So Mohsen, please, if you would kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this kind introduction. And I extend my thanks as well to Hani and Wolfgang for organizing this, and for the audience who are really the people we are communicating to, as well as communicating to the panel here. And I think the issue of the Libyan economy really is at the center of many of the topics discussed, because a lot of the grievances you hear in Libya, whether true or imagined, are to do with resources. And I take on board the idea that Libya is a distributive state, but it wasn't always a distributive state. Libya, historically, even before it was called Libya, that region was a trading state. It had major trading routes linking Africa, African interior, to Europe. And public records exist amongst many countries, and you find them in Venice, you find them in Malta, you find them in the UK, of trading activities between Libya, or current day Libya, and Europe. And that enterprising spirit was really totally shut down when Libya introduced the system of socialism that has nationalized all capital, all means of production. And that was in 1977, and it was on stages until 1982. By 1982, just about every Libyan was collecting a salary from the state, and that could be done because we had the 1973 oil price hike, and we also had the Iranian Revolution oil price hike in 1979, 1980, and we have also the Iran-Iraq war, and all of these have provided Libya with a huge amount of money, and it was very easy. You work, you just go and sign, hang around in a public office, and if your relationship with your manager is good, you don't even have to. You could Skype and collect a wage which actually offered you a decent living standard. You could buy very good brands from supermarkets. Everything was imported by the state and so forth. Except that in mid-1980s, oil price went down to $5 per barrel. And many people think that Gaddafi was actually thinking about the economy. No, he could not afford to continue with that lifestyle. And there was literally poverty in Libya. I happened to go to Tripoli in 1984 while I was an undergraduate in the UK. And or before I was undergraduate actually, and I remember there was not a single shop open in the whole city in Tripoli, and there was one supermarket that sold chlorine. That's the only product available. So the government realized that they had to change, but their approach to returning to the private sector was not to dismantle these laws and go back to very near past 1977 and cancel all these decrees and laws and go back to 1977, which wasn't hard to do, could have been done overnight. There were ad hoc adjustments, endless ad hoc adjustments, and reluctance on the part of the state to actually allow the private sector. So we ended up with a private sector that was mostly relying on state expenditure to function. It was no longer independent. By contrast, somebody recently sent me a photo of a sardine can that was manufactured in Libya 55 years ago. So sardines were captured from the Mediterranean, they were packed, they were sold, exported, consumed locally. And many small manufacturing was going on in Libya up to the early 70s. So we go fast forward, there were ad hoc adjustments. Libya went under sanctions because of Lockerbie. Post Lockerbie, there was a revival in Libya. Oil prices rose, they reached $150 per barrel with a lot of money. And there was an attempt, a shy attempt, an ad hoc attempt to actually change the system. And the private sector started to emerge, but at the same time, because there was so much money, many institutions with a lot more money than they had in the past, including LIA, including the Economic and Social Development Fund, were created. And so you have the state becoming the quickest, the fastest way to become a multimillionaire with a strike of your pen. And that started the scramble for high positions. Now there's a key moment in Libya's economy, 2003. 2003, Gaddafi became totally disengaged from internal affairs. He saw himself as a world leader. He really can't be bothered with the small things. And I heard this from some of his ministers that were actually working with him. He used to solve conflicts between different institutions. Okay, so when there are two powerful institutions disagreeing, they didn't go to court, they went to Gaddafi. Okay, didn't go to the prime minister, they went to Gaddafi. He sat them, he heard the story, and he decided one way or another. Post 2003, there was none of that. Fast forward to 2009, he discovered that all the projects that were contracted for infrastructure, etc., in the 2000s were massively overvalued. And he stopped everything around 2009. And that really was kind of the final straw, that things were not improving, that all these promises, all this money, all this increased corruption in public sector. Then we had the revolution. Now, the revolution could have started very different, but the mentality was still there. So the arguments was, we have lots of money. We have 132 billion. Oil prices are $100 per barrel. We're selling 1.5 million barrels per day. Just employ everybody again, make them happy. And so we ended up with a education sector that has a ratio of 1 to 3 teacher to student, which doesn't exist in the world. And guess what? Most of these employed are administrators. They are not actually teachers. So they actually don't have any added value to the process, but they are getting money from the state. So the state itself became captive to powerful groups, became captive to people who control these institutions. They represent immense amount of wealth. And it didn't help that we had prime ministers who were temporary, like Thini, temporary since 2014 or 14, yeah. And he's still a temporary government. And we had Sarraj, who was a government of national accord that lasted 5 years. But really, they had no plans for the time they were staying. They were just living from day to day, surviving, not upsetting anyone, sign off under any pressure. You just sign off, you let them have what they want. And so there's a big issue here about the economy, and that is society sees the state as the provider. It's a society of entitlement. Everybody is entitled. It's the masses controlling wealth, arms, and authority, exactly perhaps as Gaddafi envisaged, but as he never allowed. It became more possible post-Gaddafi. And so the state and the institutions really lost their power to do anything and became powerless, became captive to armed groups, became captive to tribes, you became captive to general public demand, for example, for increased salaries. And so really it is a huge issue that is compounded by the weakened institutions and continuously weakened institutions. There are thousands of public sector companies that actually provide, they make no sense economically, they have no added value, but they provide salaries to people. And you have not created an alternative for all of these people to move from that sector. But guess what? Many of them actually have their own businesses while still collecting salary from the government because there's no performance measurement. So it became increasingly really a collection of networks. That's what you need to survive. That's what you need to stay, to enjoy your office, to not do anything that will upset anyone. In other words, protect the status quo. Furthermore, there are other complicating factors. There is really a huge skills problem in Libya. In other words, we don't have any technical people coming out of technical colleges. We have people who go to university, graduate, and you don't know what to do with them. You really don't have something. You need people to fix roads. You need people to fix electricity. You need people to fix computers. You need people to maintain medical equipment. Yes, but you don't have enough of them. And so the whole thing is a huge mismatch. Now, can we blame the international community? To a large extent, yes, because the message that many have delivered, including myself, is that Libya needs institutional building. And I recall one of the distinguished speakers mentioning the UN having a lot more power in doing this. The only economic reform we managed to get out of the economic track, which was part of the Berlin process, was when oil sales were frozen in a bank account. Okay? Before that, you could talk. You could provide studies. You could do graphs. You could do calculations. You could explain the rationale. It doesn't matter. It's not important. Libya needs institutions to be rebuilt, and to do that, it's not going to be done locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. Again, a very searing and honest and bleak look at the reality of the development or lack of development of the Libyan economy and the reality today. And again, I'm going to, at any moment here, defer to Hani and Wolfgang to jump in and direct us and cut off questioning. But as I've done with the other speakers, Mohsen, if you permit me, I take your point, your last point there, that very little was asked of those in a position to make reforms in Libya by the international community. But this is where I really want to ask you. You know, there's so much talk about corruption, and obviously the main source of revenue and the source of tension in this distributive state that it's become is oil revenue, and it's at least it's not chaotic. There is a national oil corporation. It exists. It's an entity that seems to function with the ceasefire and so forth. It seems to have control over the product, more or less. And Mohsen, you've spoken in the past, and we've talked about in the past. Remember a couple of years back that when the militias in Tripoli were fighting each other, you called it, I remember memorably, the letters of credit war. And my question is, with you have, you know, there's so much chaos in the rest of the economy, as you say, you know, there's no match between education and the type of labor force that's needed. And here we heard from Dr. Gajiji about the municipalities. You know, they don't control the water system, and who knows who's operating that or how well that's functioning. But the oil, it's not chaotic. It's the National Oil Corporation, and it's controlled. And so my question to you is, would it be possible, if there were really concerted pressure, to simply make transparent some of these, not everything, every expenditure in the Libyan government, but the main contracts, the main the contracts that are that pertain to oil and that pertain to its out distribution, including whatever it is that this disbursement of these letters of credit. Isn't that controllable in some way? And wouldn't that at least be a start at giving some transparency and therefore some control of these big revenues? And once you start there, well, then you can start talking rationally about grievances and how to distribute this stuff. What do you think, Mohsen?
I totally agree. I think this has been discussed since 2014, and the view of some people, including myself, is that we have to control, we have to have oversight of Libya's finances. And by having transparency, oversight means transparency, means where is the money going, means you cannot have opportunities to profiteer because there is discrepancy in prices created intentionally by state institutions. You cannot control, for example, revenues of municipalities because it's not your right. It's the right of municipalities to control their revenues and to spend it, but ask them to be transparent. But I agree, at the highest level, at the macro level, revenue leaves the National Oil Company, which, by the way, making a huge effort under many difficult circumstances and many difficulties it faces in actually maintaining its pipelines and maintaining its production. It's not getting funded enough. But having said that, once you get that money out of the national oil money account, then you really need to be very clear how it's spent. And of course, the argument you get is, yeah, but this is an issue of sovereignty. My issue is we don't understand what sovereignty is anymore vis-a-vis Libya, because, for example, the 75, with all respect, many of them are not elected officials. The elected officials had their term expired long time ago. So what is legitimacy there? And what do you mean by sovereignty? I think it's more important to get the country on the right track by controlling resources and then see if the grievances are correct. Because I've looked at some of the grievances and I don't think that all of them are correct. It's an issue of managing resources. It's not actually an issue as much as a distribution. So if I go to a municipality and allow them to actually provide the services at the local level and divide the matrix of authority between central government for strategic plans, etc., national emergency, and leave the rest to local government, then I solve that problem by saying, look, this is how much money you got. It's really per capita, per area, etc. Is really fair that you got this. You just don't know how to use it. And if you want us to help you, we can help you how to use it better. Without this system in place, it's not going to work. And in a way, you've pointed to a very critical thing here, because that is the entry point to reforming the economy and reforming the political system. Take the punch bowl away, and get them to behave themselves in a reasonable way. You can have a good life, standard of living, but you have to work for it. There's no entitlement. I mean, you get people saying, well, economic circumstances are difficult. If I get a position in an embassy overseas, then that would be nice, because I get paid in in foreign exchange, foreign currency, and given the local exchange rate, that would be a great amount of money. Yes, but the question is, what can you give to that embassy? What can you give to that institution? What can you give to the health department? What can you give to the police department? And that question is totally absent because of this culture of entitlement. And you know what? What is one of the negative things that I have seen over the last few years is that cities were not like that. But they have become like that because this is what is happening all over the country. In other words, even cities fell victim to these attitudes because they are so apparent and so overwhelming, and you could see them everywhere. They joined in. Even cities joined in. So there are towns, for example, that didn't have 10% of the population working in the public sector. You go and check now, you find that they have 25% of the population working in the public sector. Why? Because additional income. There is no need for you to perform. So going to the source of income, the only source of income, controlling that, making it transparent will solve many of these problems. And then you have to face some people and say, look, you just, this is your share. This is what you're going to get. You just have to use it better. And we can help you use it better. In a way, it is very easy to fix the Libyan problem, but at the same time, given the many and conflicting interests and the vested interest and the existing network, it's very difficult.
Mohsen, thank you very much for that. I was just about to turn to that facet of it. How of this, as you say, rather feasible way of controlling the source of revenue, but getting the political will. And I think you even used the phrase, Siraj was in there and just sort of handing out the money, saying yes, 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 if that was you, I believe. And so what will get his successor to finally say no? And particularly, I guess here, and Wolfgang, maybe we circle back to you at the beginning. And again, Hani, please, you give the word. It's now 5:09, so just by all means jump in anytime. But Wolfgang, I come back to you. Mohsen is here saying, look, it's feasible, actually. There is a solution to this whole Libyan crisis. Turn off the spigot. But the political will to do that is very difficult because there's this culture now widespread, even at municipal level, culture of entitlement, as Mohsen described. And,
so Edward, I was going to suggest something.
Wolfgang, I was just going to close and say, Wolfgang, some of these constituencies have weapons. Some of them are called militias with weapons. So I leave, Hani, I leave with you, I leave with Wolfgang to carry us through.
Here's what I'm going to be suggesting, because we're running late. I'm going to merge the final panel with this one here, and then basically leave the questions to the end to all of them. And the final panel is about another transitional government and presidential council, what to expect. And many of us are in tune as to the event and the course that has happened in the last 6 weeks with the 75 individuals that were gathered by Stephanie Williams. Still, there's a lot of questions about how that happened, but the product was a necessity. And we have now a new interim government and a new president. And I would like to invite Mohammed Ejara in 2 to 3 minutes to explain to us very briefly how this thing happened and where we are right now. And then basically I would invite everybody else to share in the discussion about what to expect. Mohammed, are you with us, please?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hani, and it's good to be with all of you. I'll try and be very brief in the 2-3 minutes, and I usually take the role of the skeptic or pessimist about the process that has been led by the United Nations. I mean, I see lots of euphoria and lots of hope, be it inside Libya with the polling that D1 Research did, or also in the way that many in the international community are trying to receive the news of the formation of a new government with a little bit of euphoria, etc. So it is going to be my job to try and cast some doubt about the foundations on which this hope is actually blazed. Now, on the day that the new government was selected, I was on a Libyan TV channel in a panel discussion, and one of the participants...
Mohammed, before you go on this, can you very briefly describe to us the process and how it happened? Because many of us are not in tune to it. Please, just briefly.
You mean the UN process?
Correct. Yeah.
The way that the government has been selected. Okay. So as we all know, that the UN-led process started when Khalifa Haftar's forces were defeated on the outskirts of Tripoli, supported by the United Arab Emirates and the Russians, and following the Turkish intervention in support of the government of national accord. What happened is that the war ended and the red lines or the war lines or the fault lines were drawn in the Sirte Jofra region of Libya. I would say that these lines were imposed by Turkey, Russia, and Egypt. And what that has resulted in is obviously since the guns went silent, in April to June 2020, last year, politics started. And the United Nations launched this political process and picked 75 participants for this process and tasked them with drafting a political roadmap for a new transitional phase, and then the selection of a new Libyan government, which happened a couple of, or at least a couple of weeks ago in Geneva. So that's in brief what the process was, or how the process actually unfolded. So is that enough?
That's fair enough. And how were the 75 chosen?
Yeah, so the 75 were chosen a mix of members of the House of Representatives and members of the State Council. And then also the United Nations Support Mission to Libya picked some representative from the civil society and from women and youth groups, and also some what they called independents, if you like. The process started with a track 2, if you like, dialogue that was led by the Humanitarian Dialogue Center. And again, many question marks were raised about the role of the Humanitarian Dialogue Center and the sessions that they held in Lausanne and in Montreux, and the individuals who were invited to these meetings, and the secrecy that surrounded these meetings, especially given that the result that we ended up with, the government that we ended up with, involved some of these individuals in those secret meetings that not many Libyans know exactly what went on in those meetings. So that is how the participants were chosen. And obviously there was lots of pushback at some point against the way that the 75 were selected, but I think there will always be a huge issue with legitimacy of who represents whom in Libya in such a political process or a political dialogue.
Fair enough. So, so carry on back to what your thought process. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but please go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that I like to play the role of a skeptic here. And as I said, that when the result of the new government was announced, I was taking part in a debate on a Libyan TV channel, and one of the panelists was Ustad Abdel Hafid Ghoga, the deputy chairman of the former National Transitional Council that led the opposition against Gaddafi in 2011. And during the discussions, he used the following phrase. I described that the winning list was the worst list for Libya, and that this list is most likely not going to unify Libya and is going to lead Libya to yet another phase of conflict and another phase of war. And the answer to that was ليس بالإمكان أفضل مكان. And I could see this was echoed. This same message was echoed by Stephanie in her article that was published in Brookings today, where she says it's relatively easy to point to risks, weaknesses and imperfections in the LBDF process. What is harder is finding an alternative path that does not squander the most promising moment Libya had in years. So this is the attitude, this is the hope, or this is the foundation of the hope that many are building on, as in what is the alternative? And I think
there is no other better alternative.
That is the justification. So the justifications for the imperfection, if you like, of this process. But I think there were some fatal mistakes anyway in this process. The vetting process, be it of the participants within the LBDF, the 75, or the vetting process of the candidates for the president, the presidency council, and the prime minister. It was very poor to non-existent. And I think this is going to come and haunt this process. And I think this was a fatal mistake that could have been easily avoided if we had a little bit of a structure or a methodology in the way that vetting happened. Again, the question of corruption that surrounded the process here in Tunis, but also in Geneva, is also problematic and is going to come back and haunt this process. And it is unfortunate that the United Nations did not release its finding of the investigation before the formation of the government, especially that one of the individuals who was implicated in these investigations is now the prime minister. So there is a little bit of a conflict of interest here. Whether will the United Nations actually end up releasing an investigation or the results of an investigation that is going to state that yes, there was corruption that led to one of those individuals implicated in corruption to becoming a prime minister through a UN-led dialogue process or peace process.
So the accusation to emphasize has been that Dubeiba was, or his group has been involved in some of the allegations of attempting to bribe some of the individuals within those 75. Is that correct?
Yes, so you have two Dubeibas involved. So you have Ali Dubeiba, who's member of the dialogue, the 75, and then Abdel Hamid Dubeiba, his nephew, who is the now the prime minister of Libya. So unfortunately, the panel of experts did not release its findings yet. But again, how much can we have trust in whatever findings, given that the results are coming out after one of the individuals implicated has become Libya's prime minister, and it is going to implicate a process that was led and run by the United Nations. So again, that is a very dark cloud that will remain there and will be discussed going forward. And a last point, and there is a lot to discuss about this, is the fact that now this whole government depends on two things. Number one, it depends on the Libyan House of Representatives being united and actually endorsing this government and giving it confidence. Failing that and giving that task to the 75 is going to be the start of the end, if you like, for this newly born government, because its legitimacy is going to be questioned, just like the legitimacy of the GNA was questioned before it. The other hurdle that will face this government is a divided UN Security Council and a divided international community that's involved in Libya. With this surprise result, you have Egypt, you have France, who are really unhappy with this result. The United States is also trying to figure out what to do with this new result, given that they supported the losing list of Aguila Fathi Bashagha. And on the other hand, you have countries like the UAE, Russia, and Turkey in particular, who are happy with this result, and Haftar as well inside Libya. And if you think about it, these are the same actors who have led Libya to war in 2019. These are the same actors, and they are happy with this result, in my view, not for the right reasons, but for their own reasons, because Haftar, in a way, believes that now he remains a fixture for Eastern Libya, and he is now back as a kingmaker in Eastern Libya, and he views this new government as a weak government that he could easily attack or undermine or question its legitimacy if he does not get what he wants from this government. And I think Egypt currently is actively involved in an attempt to try and prevent the House of Representatives from convening or uniting and endorsing this government.
So in other words, what you're saying is that because there is a sense that this may not be workable, the ultimate, coming up with an effective government, that the powers to be on the ground, which is what Wolfgang had mentioned early on when he said, if you exclude the players on the ground, you're not likely going to have a sort of an effective government, you will. And now you have those who are not those who are not chosen, taking advantage potentially of this to their benefit, maintaining the status quo. Is that right? Wolfgang,
yeah.
Wolfgang, could you jump in on this one here, please, and let me know your thoughts? Wolfgang?
Could you repeat, please? I could hardly understand you.
I guess the question really is, you had emphasized in your speech, in your talk, that one of the key elements of successful, effective governance is going to be making sure that you don't exclude the players on the ground. So now the players on the ground are not formally on the government, but they're seeing a sort of a weak process or a weak potential government, which they can manipulate or run with and maintain the status quo ante that they themselves are benefiting from.
Well, I would say what is now of significance during the next days is that will the House of Representatives, one could ask which House of Representatives, give confidence to the nominated government. As Mohammed El-Char just mentioned, the question is, will the new government have some kind of legitimacy? Yes, the process in which the persons were selected is quite doubtful, no doubt about it. But if the House of Representatives, which House of Representatives one could ask, gives them the confidence, we would have right now a new government, which would be the only one government in Libya which has legitimacy. I nevertheless think it will be extremely difficult for them to get the real confidence of the various groups in the east and in the west and in the south. Actually, for the time being, they have received lip services from everyone that they are in support of them. They are in support of them as long as the new government, if it is really confirmed, is not doing anything against their interests. But I wonder how quick this will change if the new government really takes some action, let's say about the Russians or about Turkey or about this and that or about stopping smuggling in Fezzan. So I fear that it will be extremely challenging for this government, if it is endorsed, to change anything really on the ground. I would say for this reason, first and foremost, of significance is that the ceasefire we have right now, and which is more or less holding around Sirte, is consolidated by an international civilian monitoring mission. So the current political situation where everyone cheers the new government and where everyone is looking for consensus should be used to consolidate the situation on the ground.
But to be the devil's advocate here, I mean, the country is so fractured that whatever you do, whoever you chose, there's going to be a significant portion that is not happy with the product. And the whole process, the political process, has been, designed in a way to bring in an interim body, regardless of the disagreements and so on. They can just simply carry this, the country as an acting executive until December. So, time flies very quickly. We know that Siraj has actually governed for several years without even approval of the House of Representatives. So, and yet the country carried on in a dysfunctional way, yes, but this is only 10 months. One can argue that with some support and so on, it could do a job. But then after that, what are we looking at? We're looking at elections. We're looking at constitutional referendum. I want to bring in Mansour as well. What do you think, Mansour? Do you think that's something that is practical, that can survive and function, or is this going to be a sort of a hiatus that everybody will be looking at December and not knowing, first of all, not surviving with electricity and liquidity and so on, and then just face a referendum on constitution and elections? What do you see in the future?
Well, the same promise was given to us by the governments, whether it was in the East or the West. They were supposed to say only for 1 year. Like the GNA, for example, was supposed to say for 1 year, but till new elections. But that lasted went on from 15 to 21. And my major fear is that, this is going to say 1 year until the elections of December, and they will stay for another 5 or 6 years, and then you will have the sycophants and drum beaters for them for another 5 or 6 years, and Libya will not get out of this mess it's in. The truth is, I looked at those names of these individuals, and my jaw dropped, because Dubaiba, why would I choose Dubaiba in the first place? I mean, it isn't that Aguila Salah is better. No, I'm sorry, he's not better. I mean, but why do we have to choose the worst and not the best? Is Libya so barren, doesn't have good people anymore to govern it, to lead it? This is my major concern. And the United Nations playing this role of trying to appease one group after another makes no sense to me. And so, the truth is, I don't know what we can use to get out of this mess. I just don't know. I mean, ultimately, maybe the solution is separate it. Let Cyrenaica, Tripotania, and Bazan go independently, since we can't live with each other in any meaningful way. But we can't keep on going in the same fashion that we're been going to the last 5 years and the next 5 years. I mean, I was so impressed with the presentation of the economic presentation. I mean, he's so right. And I wish there was somebody who actually got up and spoke and said this publicly. They don't do this publicly, unfortunately. They would do it outside in such forums, but we don't do it internally in Libya because we're afraid. We're afraid of Haftar. Haftar was such a disappointment to me. I thought that a person who's lived 23 years in the United States, what development is like, would be wise enough to see that what he needs to do in Libya. He did the exact opposite. He's becoming worse than Gaddafi. And I meant, why? The Emirates, Russia, Turkey, they're not Egypt, they're not guardians of Libya. We've seen this in Lebanon. We've seen this in the 75, these proxy wars, where we have these wars that are destroying Lebanon has not come out of that war of 1975 until today. They're still suffering from that war. Why are you doing this to Libya too? Are Libyans so stupid that they don't realize the dangers facing them? I don't
Well, I'm
choose a
going to-
government like this. Why?
Well, your point is well taken. I'm going to get closer to the whole process and ask an individual who was part of that Libyan political process, Zahra Lengi, to jump in on this one here. Zahra, can you step in and give us your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hani. I think I share many of the thoughts already stated here in this panel of Mohammed Jarrah or Dr. Mansour, Wolfgang as well. It's an imperfect process, as Stephanie herself in her article today has rightly stated. And it's the result, which was a surprise to all, not surprise to some of us who were whistleblowers and who were saying, watch out for the influence of political money. I think we failed, and as I've been saying this throughout the last 2 weeks, as Mohammed has rightly stated, in the vetting process. And there will be major challenges ahead of us next week. Actually, tomorrow, it's the period for the Constitutional Committee that is composed of the HOR and the High Council, State Council will be over. And they have not, yes, they have reached an agreement. However, they have not reached a quorum for the HOR to amend the constitutional declaration to introduce the changes regarding the referendum. So mark my word, there will be no referendum. And the international community and the UN will be clear and adamant that there will be no referendum. Last week, the head of the Election Commission said that if we are going to have a referendum process, that will jeopardize the elections, the national elections, which are clearly stated on the 24th of December, according to the roadmap. This is the only achievement. If we're going to say there is an achievement for the Libyan political dialogue, is this date in the roadmap that is full of gaps. The problem is now, if we don't have a quorum and this government is not endorsed, as Mohammed was saying, it will go back to us. The problem is, so many of us, and I think I've shared this earlier in a webinar that the National Council has organized before, there is no TOR, there is no legal structure for the LPDF. So it's more than a legitimacy problem. According to the LPDF, the matter will go to us. But then what will happen? How are we going to endorse it? Based on what? What is the nisab, the quorum that is needed to endorse the government? All of this is missing. So I think, as a member of the legal committee as well, in the Libyan political dialogue, and I've said that we need a TOR for the LPDF, we need to address the gaps in the roadmap.
Why didn't that happen, Zahra? I'm sorry to interrupt, but why didn't that happen if this has already been raised?
Yes, we have been calling out. You've seen us even in public.
I know, but why do you think? Yes, but why do you think that did not happen?
I think the problem is that UN, the ONSML, trying to not offend the two major factions here, or parties, the HOR and the High Council, they didn't want to create a new institution. So that's why it was used more like a stick. Remember what I said earlier in an earlier webinar, that we don't really have legislative, we are not a legislative body. We don't have any clear mandate. So that will come and haunt us. That's why the only way out now is to expedite the elections. We need to have to take exceptional measures and to have elections as soon as possible, because as highlighted by Muhammad, the report of the panel of experts is coming out in May. And there will be a special appendix about this issue of bribery and political money. And this, I think, will be the major challenge that needs to be obstacle that needs to be really addressed with setting out anti-corruption measures for the coming elections as well. So this will be there. And the issue of corruption is already, it's the worst choice, because there were serious allegations and the investigation is still on. So, and this process, yes, it was, we managed not to make it influenced by regional and international politics, but what influenced it was political money. So I don't see anything coming out from this government. It will not be endorsed by the HOR. There are serious problems of how to have it even endorsed by the LPDF. So the only way forward I see ahead of us is expediting the national elections. We are meeting the legal committee tomorrow, the coming 3 days. We will be, this is virtually, by the end of February, we will be meeting in Tunis, a physical meeting to address several issues, among which is the issue of the constitutional rule or framework that is needed for the elections. The other issue is to address the endorsement. However, I think that will be a major challenge, as we don't even have a legal structure. So we don't have a mandate to do that. So that will be a serious problem. So there's no way except expediting the elections, unfortunately.
I want to bring in Mohammed Aderi. Mohammed, are you still with us here? I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the next 10 months. How do you see them? How do you see the process of structuring a government, and assuming that it would be approved or not approved? We have in Libya gotten used to the idea that, you know, whether you get approval of the HOR or not, you just basically establish a government, create facts, and you kind of guard and govern until the next point, milestone comes in, which is the constitution. What do you see, Mohammed?
Is he
Mohammed
there?
Aderi? Are you still there?
He's not here.
Mohammed? I guess we lost Mohammed Aderi. Well, I'm going to pass this on to Mohammed Jarrah again. You know, Mohammed, what do you think? What are they going to be those next 10 months, assuming that they're not going to be voted on? People need to eat and drink and go to work and get liquidity and electricity and so on. What do you see?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I had it written as in, okay, it's good to be skeptical sometimes, but also how can we be constructive as well in trying to come up with solutions or ways that we deal with what we have now. And I just want to agree with Professor Mansour here. And we should not be limited to really terrible choices and told that this is the best that we can do for you. I think I expected better from a UN-led process, to be honest. I expected better for Libya And that is why I was disappointed as a Libyan and also skeptical. But to go back, I have to agree with Zahra about the obstacles that we have regarding how this government will be endorsed. I think one of the issues that we have is going to be, once the political process reaches a dead end, that is what we should be planning for. I definitely subscribe to the idea that Zahra just mentioned, which is to expedite the elections, to go to the elections immediately if we fail to have a government. Because failing that, if we do not have an alternative already to this government being endorsed, then what will happen is a political deadlock, and what we will end up with is another war, most likely, and another conflict. Because that is the two are an extension of each other, if you like. I am worried that we have some Libyan factions, but also some foreign countries that are involved in Libya that are definitely now weighing their options. Some of them are really not happy, and they are currently involved in an effort to try and sabotage any progress, just because it goes against what they consider to be their own national interest in Libya. And the warning is this, Dr. Hani. The previous wars in Libya have happened inside the old, inside cities and inside the old regions, i.e. inside Benghazi, inside Derna, inside Sabha, Fazan, or inside Tripoli. Now the war lines are clearly drawn on the three old regions, or the lines of the three old historical regions. So if we get to a point where there is another war, and we should do everything to avoid that, that war is going to be a different kind of war. And I worry that by then we would be talking about
hard partition.
Wolfgang, please go ahead.
Sorry, just one sentence. And this is exactly the reason why I've said before that now there is the opportunity to consolidate the ceasefire. I'm sure, and I promise, if the international community and the current political environment, whoever this environment may be, don't consolidate the ceasefire right now, we will see exactly what Mohammed just predicted.
So you basically, if I'm hearing you well, you're talking about a hard partition versus a soft partition, a political process which can actually lead to some sort of a federation or something like this, versus a confrontation which would lead to challenges and a hard partition. You know, these are all.
I'm thinking worse, actually, Dr. Hani.
Very concerning, very concerning. I hope that there is some reason that will prevail. I hope that with all the weaknesses in this whole model and so on, that somehow there's a reconciliation process that will lead to some sort of allowing an entity to govern until an election can come peacefully. I also want to, we've heard that the big five countries have blessed this outcome. All the outsiders have actually blessed it. The insiders too, who are potentially spoilers, have also blessed the outcome of this process. I want to ask Edward, watching all this and so on, and you have State Department that has just changed leadership, a new government here in the United States. They're looking at Libya as with a fresh eye on what and how the United States should be involved. Could you share with us, perhaps, if you were to make recommendations to politicians here in Washington, D.C., what would that be in regards to the next phase vis-a-vis U.S. relations with Libya?
Hani, thanks. I want to answer that, and you put the question very well. I just sensed that Mohammed had something else. He just wanted to close what his concern is. So before I speak,
no, I said what I wanted to say is that what Dr. Hani described about federation and so on and the type of partition, I'm talking about something that's much worse. We already have examples of this, where you have foreign countries coming in to draw the lines, and then they have their militaries patrolling those lines, and then they can be also dictating political processes, i.e. we're talking about something that could be similar to an Astana-like process. I know some people are saying it's far-fetched, Libya is different, but I think there are countries that have tried this, it worked for them, and they will be willing to try this again.
If I may, one thing, please. Okay, yeah, you forgot something very, very important. That for the last 7 years, okay, Libya has been separate. You had governments, you have two governments, two parliaments, two armies. You have a two separate countries. I think too many people are comfortable in that. And this is my major fear. Hani, Dr. Hani, you bring up a very good point. You hope not, and I hope not. But what I'm seeing now is that there is a move towards that. And this is really very serious. You know, if there is another war, okay, it's the we versus them anymore. To be we versus them. We don't want them anymore. Okay. And this is a huge problem which the United Nations doesn't even take into account.
You know, I'm going to get back to you, Edward, because it's very important to get at least formulate some ideas about how the United States should be dealing with all this. I mean, we have a very active ambassador who has been, flying mileages and mileages to trying to reconcile and support support the political process. The United States spends enormous amount of money through USAID and others to stabilize the country, and yet there's all this kind of uncertainty that is happening in there. How does the United States lead if it is interested in leading, and how would it formulate its policy vis-a-vis Libya in the next 10 months until elections or otherwise?
Hani, here's how I see it, and it's simply my take. It doesn't obviously doesn't represent what is the perceptions or the viewpoint of the new administration at all. So you start, anytime we talk about U.S. policy, you start and you begin with U.S. interests. And in Libya, U.S. interests have been defined by their absence, the absence of a compelling U.S. interest in the outcome. It's not just Libya, and Libyans should not feel, oh my gosh, we're the only country, no, it's not. And the other country, there are many conflicts around the world where the U.S. has a overall general interest in wanting to see a stable outcome, but not a particular interest, a compelling one that's going to get it invested. And we know, Libya has a particular history with the United States because of Benghazi and Chris Stevens, and and a generalized aversion to that, and a focus on counterterrorism. And look at the dilemmas of the U.S. in Afghanistan, where there's this enormous investment, and it's still a huge dilemma, of wanting to be disinvolved. So there's not going to be, again, speaking for myself, you start from a viewpoint of not this overarching desire to be invested, and so, but that doesn't mean there's zero interest. That's just the point of departure. That's number one. There's not, so number two is, so what is the let's call it the residual interest that you have if you don't have this compelling? Well, it's like everyone else. The U.S. wants to see Libya stabilized and this conflict end, and the country emerge in some fashion of a pathway to stability, and with diminished, let's call it dubious influence of the likes of Russia and Turkey, if possible. And so that's the second sort of residual interest. Then the third, so what would the U.S. be willing to do about it? And when you look at the landscape, and you've heard, these experts describe it very well. Mohammed Eljar just described it very well. This is a deeply unsatisfactory process, but what I would imagine, this is a guess, is, I would use this phrase, something is better than nothing. That in other words, the Stephanie Williams characterization of this, for all the shortcomings that Mohammed and Zara pointed out, I would imagine that the thinking would be something is better than nothing. And so then the question is, if something is better than nothing, even if it's, okay, how can we at least preserve this something and avoid that outcome that Mohammed was talking about? And the way you would do that is you would try to attack the forces that would are trying to undermine this very unsatisfactory something. And Mohammed didn't name them, but I presume he meant France and some others, because Mohammed mentioned that Russia and Egypt and, or if I understood it, Russia and Turkey are and Haftar are all satisfied with this, but for bad reasons, not because good reasons, but for bad reasons. So you would, even though those are bad reasons, you would look at the ones who would try to destabilize it. So if it's France, the US would try to get there to be some European coherent viewpoint on supporting this. As Zara pointed out, which may even be the design of Stephanie. This is what I was thinking when Zara was saying at the end, you know, the LPDF is hamstrung. They will not create a third institution to compete with and rival the High State Council or the House of Representatives. So therefore, there can be no real legal standing for the LPDF, and therefore, as Zara put it very well, the only alternative is elections. And I wonder if that wasn't by design. I wonder if Stephanie and whoever, you know, the humanitarian HDC Center, you know, Geneva, if their thinking wasn't, we know this is lousy, we know it, but we're gonna just create a very, very limited vehicle, not even a government, a vehicle to get us to elections. And this clicked when I was listening to Zara, and I wonder if that was just sort of the thing is, look, this thing is so chaotic, there'll never be some kind of serious political agreement, Haftar and all these people and everyone pulling together and somehow. So let's just create this and literally probably some of these people, you know, may well have been bought off. And we're just create this interim vehicle that will get us to elections and we'll see where we are. And so my answer to your question, Hani, is if, I'm guessing here, we would be okay. So the US should do what it can in this very unsatisfactory context to get to these elections, to fend off the spoilers, to try to make that the election at least be reasonably plausible, to deal with issues like Dr. Gajiji was talking about, whatever those are, the technical side, get the turnout up, make sure there's extremists are not committing violence and trying to create and support that type of conditions and get an election. And then proceed from there. Hani, that's my answer to you.
Well, I think that's pretty good answer. It's all about U.S. interests, about combating terrorism, about securing borders, about stabilizing the country to the benefit of the region. So those are very, very important things. Now, Maxim Drega, are you there? I'd like to give you a chance to jump on this whole subject. What do you see happening in the next 10 months, and where's it going?
Well, something interested me, said by Mansour, and that is that various parties in Libya are in it for themselves. Put aside the rhetoric, injustice. The numbers don't lie. How much money was spent in Libya, how much money was used, what it was used for, they don't lie. They give you a picture of people interested, sometimes even in continuing with the status quo because it pays off. The absence of statesmen and women at the level of at the level of controlling key institutions that see beyond that limited personal interest is a big problem. And again, I refer back to what he said. There's withdrawal from many Libyans who cannot operate in this environment. It's an environment of hugely corrupt. It's an environment where you can't have any values or any standards. Anything goes, to stay and siphon off resources. And this actually kicks out a lot of the people who should be running things, who would actually put country before themselves, who would actually think about the millions of Libyans and their future and the future of Libya, and not regard it as somewhere you load from, and then you buy a property somewhere else in another country and live outside it because it's not good enough. There is no electricity, there is no health service. The focus on personal interest is just overwhelming. And without getting people in these key institutions controlling the flow of resources, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. I mean, if we think about elections, how are we going to have elections? I can tell you that in Western Libya, in most parts, there will be elections. In South Libya, I'm not so sure. In East Libya, I'm not so sure. So, if you suppose we have elections, and we have elections in Tripoli region, but no elections in the south, and some elections in the east, what's going to happen? I mean, this is
very, very fierce questions.
And the thing is, I don't want to take too long, but the thing is, the United Nations do say, and I understand, Stephanie Williams worked extremely hard in very difficult circumstances, and it was no small achievement. But there are other things that could have been achieved. For example, we had calls, because I presented to the LPDF with another colleague of mine, important facts about the Libyan economy, telling them that, look, you had 60 years of oil, you've achieved nothing, you need to get things moving. You have key files that you need to deal with: electricity, healthcare, COVID vaccination, etc. Must deal with these. Some people contacted me from LPDF saying, can you actually put this in form of resolution that will make it enforceable? And you know what? It was a struggle to get people to buy into that. Why? I don't understand why not. And also the interest from the LPDF itself, because they got trapped in their own problems and discussions and, trading, that became irrelevant. The most important thing is to get our guy in office, whatever.
I don't want to be a pessimist more than what I've heard today, but I remember 40 years ago when I was involved with medical aid for Palestinians, and everybody was looking at different type of solutions, the Oslo and so on and so on. I made a commitment that at the end of the day, there are people in the ground that are desperate for water, for food, for healthcare, and so on, and that there needs to be a maintenance of all those essential things, and that contributions can be a lot better if one would focus at the ground level and help the people at the ground level until the big guys figure out what they need to do with the bigger picture. So it seems to me that Libyans deserve better than what is happening right now. They're really struggling on a day-to-day basis. They're basically flabbergasted about the complexity that they see ahead of them, and they may not even understand the processes that are happening, but all they want is very, very basic things, very, very basic needs. I hope the next 10 months would bring in some of this. I hope that some of the negatives that we've anticipated and are very worried about are ameliorated in certain ways. I hope we are heading towards to an election in December that will bring a product that would be helpful. The worst possible thing is that we hang our expectations on an election, and then it would be an election to what? A big question then will be kind of clouding our future. So I am sorry if I've missed anybody in this. I tried to bring in everybody in this very dynamic conversation. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Wolfgang particularly for organizing this, and my co-chair, Edward, and everybody that participated. Certainly, we will be following this very carefully, and we will have some more webinars on this. We kind of stretched a little bit our time, but we hope we will be more efficient next time. Thank you all for being with us in this very exciting webinar. Thank you.